Hey guys, how are you all? Welcome to Let's Start Story on What If Drunk Naruto Took Advantage from Innocent Raven Part 2, so do 4 blue hearts comment, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video and please share with your friends and watch till end. Also check out Patreon for I have upload Naruto X Rias and Akino uncensored spicy version, link in description. Shadows of doubts. Fear creeping around the corner, just behind the shoulder, counting every little mistake, waiting to pounce at the hesitation. Taiyang's body clenched when Naruto called him down. A hand placed on his shoulder softly, telling him to calm down, did little to abate his cautious disposition. He turned and saw Summer smiling at him with her thumb up, and he felt slightly calmer. Thanks. Her smile widened, and he managed to crack a small upturn on his lips. He looked forward and stood up and walked to the bottom of the steps, and then jumped down to the ground level. Channeling a small portion of his aura to his body to prevent the weights of injuring any joints due to the increased impact. He landed in a crouch, and then marched forwards with a set frown. His eyes shaky but resolute to succeed. Naruto had finally turned away from the headmaster and shifted his gaze over to Taiyang with a genuine smile. You can take them off. He looked up to Summer and nodded. The girl seemed to understand immediately and threw the black key down. Casually, he caught it between his index and middle finger, and held it still in the air for all to see. This is proof that hard work can make a difference, Taiyang. 1 week of work is no laughing matter, but is simply a reminder that one's work ethic extended over a long period of time is the consistency that creates miracles. Know this before your spar. Taiyang took the key from Naruto's outstretched hands and unlocked the weights on his limbs. A deep sense of satisfaction as the weight released from their clasps spread across his body. And he felt the relief of 300 pounds let go of him. He experimentally stretched his body and moved for a bit. I'm faster than before. I also feel a lot lighter. He hopped in place on the balls of his feet, preparing for his spar with a cautiously optimistic heart. Maybe this would be an opportunity to see how much he had grown. Not only to show the rest of the class that he wasn't the same student that he was on the first day, but also to prove to himself that he wasn't a failure. That he could have as much growth as his own team and be able to provide cover and utility to them. Naruto walked to the middle of the arena and pulled out a scroll. His head tilted up, and his eyes slowly scanned across the students. He placed his hands on his hips. After tapping on his scroll and putting it away, and the telltale signs of the arena displaying its 2 fighters played out. Taiyang felt his heart sink. Today is going to be a bit special. It has been 1 month and a week since the first day of classes, so I'm going to spar each person individually. I will provide you with critiques and scores later tonight, so please be aware of your scrolls after around 8 p.m. I believe in every one of you, so come at me with the same intent as I told you on the first day. Raven hardly felt the same excitement that the rest of her peers experienced. She had sparred with the professor every other day, and it was for this reason only that Raven was able to keep a level head and remain relatively calm in the midst of all the teenage energy. Being the case, she couldn't help but let a small smirk adorn her lips, as even she felt some kind of anticipation for her spar. Summer felt vexed, but was hopeful. She did not want to let the professor down, so she was willing to give it all that she had. For the past month, he had been pushing her and had given her something she hadn't felt in a long time. A dedication to her as a student. All of her other professors had gifted her a look of hope, but not in the way that Professor Naruto had. He looked at her as if she still had so much untapped potential, whereas all of her other professors in her years had seen her as a hope of her generation. As if she had reached the pinnacle, and would only continue to grow because she would get older and have more experience. As if she had already realized her potential at a young age. And yet was the star of her generation. It was difficult to meet expectations, but with Naruto, it felt as if his expectations were something to look forward to, rather than something that weighed heavily on her shoulders. Kiro felt uncaring. It was the same thing as the first day, but with a different audience. There was the single variable in the situation, which was the headmaster. The very same headmaster had seen Raven and Kiro and had given them a special entrance into the academy along with a scholarship. Not only did they not have to pay a dime out of their pocket for the education the school provided, but they were actually given money to stay. As the headmaster said, they were an investment for the future. Kiro felt his mood dip slightly at the memory, but otherwise remained neutral. He was here, and that was what mattered. He needed to become strong first. All other opinions on the situation felt rather unimportant in the long run. Taiyang had it the worst of the four. Imminent demise was directly in front of him. Naruto was already in stance, and the blonde's position was steady and resolute. There was no minute shifting. If not the fact that Taiyang knew that the professor was just talking a moment ago, he would have thought the professor to be a stone or an ornament to the training facility. His heart raced, and the blood and his veins were shifting between fiery hot with embarrassment and fear, and arctic cold with worry. He recalled how badly he had been beaten on the first day, and he could hardly comprehend how this bout would be any different than then. Naruto was so much stronger than he was back then, so what would be the deciding factor for any change today? Breathe. That single word had so much command, yet such a calming nature. That Taiyang listened and breathed. He did nothing but breathe. He inhaled and exhaled, focusing on the breath alone as the air filled his lungs and slowly escaped his lips. Nothing else mattered in this moment. Naruto nodded slowly, a smile already gracing the boy's lips as he always had. His eyes crinkled, and he slid further into a stance. Defend yourself. That was the only warning Taiyang received before he was besieged by a flurry of strikes. He barely tilted his head to the left when a punch went directly for his face, the fist nearly sliding by his nose. He forked his head even further back when he saw the hand come back for his face with an open palm. The professor was intent on using his face as a grip. Duck. He instinctively listened as a kick whiffed right overhead, the leg sweeping above his head with such force that his hair was forced upright for a second before dropping to his normal mop. Out of reflex, he righted himself immediately and backflipped away to assess the situation. The professor was standing in the middle of the arena, his right leg up and his arms high, guarding his face. Not bad. You're a little faster than before. Once again, the professor rushed him. Naruto threw out a few experimental jabs, each of which Taiyang managed to redirect away from his body or lessen the blow, taking the hits with his aura and reducing the damage taken. However, none of them were direct hits. Something inside of his stirred. An instinct flared a warning, and he listened, bringing both of his hands high. Suddenly, Naruto was above him. A leg coming from above as the blonde professor front flipped in the air to build momentum with his axe kick. It was far too late to dodge, so Taiyang channeled aura into his arms and prayed that it would successfully block. The moment that the professor's leg made contact against his guard, Taiyang nearly stumbled at the force that struck him downwards. His knees buckled, but he braced himself. As if it was possible. The professor increased the weight of his kick, and Taiyang's guard finally broke, his arms dropping and his shoulders couldn't bear the weight any longer. His body was forced to the ground. His hands slamming against the floor and his head low. Without a moment's hesitation, he rolled on the ground to create distance. In a show of flexibility and supreme athletics, Taiyang rolled on his back and onto his hands, using it as a springboard to push off nearly 30 feet away from his starting point. Sliding on the ground, Taiyang immediately checked his surroundings, hissing in pain at the same time. His eyes zoned in on Naruto, who was standing still with a calm, reserved emotion on his face. He hated that look. It wasn't the smile that the professor normally had on his face. It was different, far different. Almost alien on the professor's lips, and so unwelcome that it felt like it shouldn't have ever been there. It was as if he were nothing more than just another individual. Something for the professor to analyze and break down with ease. And yet, there was a small portion of the professor still in that small lilt of the lips, the smile hardly gracing the expression of Naruto by the tiniest of margins. It was through this that Taiyang knew that Naruto was not taking this seriously. The only thing he was taking seriously was teaching him how to fight and grading his improvement, but that was it. Naruto was eyeing his movement and reactions, but was limiting himself so as not to injure him. For some reason, this made his blood run with flames. Volcanic anger spewed forth, and he felt his semblance begging to be used. He'd only need one hit to make this work. Just one single hit to get this all started and make the professor rethink how seriously to take this graded exercise. No. To me, this is more than just a grade. This is my pride and my strength being tested. Taiyang burst forth, channeling as much aura as he safely could into his legs, back. Oming one with speed as a tunnel of air came into life. Naruto's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, but the professor was already in movement, his hand in place to defend against a punch directed towards his liver. However, what he didn't expect was the punch to be so light, considering how quickly the blonde student had come at him. He experimentally blocked another punch with the same amount of effort, expecting it to be equally soft. He was mildly surprised when his hand was blown backwards with far more force than the first hit. Resetting quickly, Naruto prepared himself for a punch, adjusting his strength level to the second hit. When the kick came, it appeared in the form of a roundhouse that sped towards the right side of his ribs. He blocked it with his right arm, but once again he was shocked by the amount of force that came into the kick. Despite how powerful the kick was, it had blown Naruto's hair in the same direction of the kick, the locks of bright blonde billowing to the left without abandon. The professor remained standing in the same spot, his feet remaining locked in place. He had not budged. Taiyang kept up in offense, picking up speed and power as he kept his assault up. The longer he attacked, the more powerful he became. Faster, more accurate. It was as if each hit he landed against Naruto's blocks added up into the next attack, and into the next consecutive blow. And these successive strikes would collectively add up in the following offensive strikes. Naruto kept blocking the flurry of blows, steadily increasing the amount of strength he put in to his limbs as the force of the blows came harsher and harsher over time. He dutifully noted that Taiyang became stronger and faster on a linear scale, based on the momentum and force he placed in his previous strike. With that, he was easily able to adjust to the battle as Taiyang blurred around the arena. The student was using more aura for offense than Naruto had used for defense. It was Curry. NTLY around 70% aura left for Taiyang, whereas Naruto still had yet to use a single drop of aura. Indeed, everything that Naruto used was simply physical strength. It wasn't because Taiyang was weaker than he was at the moment. That may have been a part of it, but the majority of the cause for why he had no need for aura was the gap in experience and skill between the two. His eyes were capable of locking onto the student and keeping up with the blisteringly fast pace that most first years would have difficulty maintaining a solid look on, much less defending themselves against. After all, it was a Herculean task to ask a first year to defend against something they could barely see. But Naruto could see, so he remained steadfast and calm, using the option that required the least effort and movement. Readjust his form and blocking with relative ease. Occasionally, he would push Taiyang's strikes and kicks in a different direction, adjusting the force and the direction of the attack. Taiyang began to realize, after nearly a minute of attacking relentlessly without pause, that Naruto was still able to keep up with him, even with his semblance ramped up to such a degree. He wasn't surprised, but he was slightly put out, and the fire in his chest that burnt hot early like a supernova was cooling into a white dwarf. It was still hot, and still very dense in his chest, but no longer the same burning passion that made him suddenly take the offensive. He rushed forward, meeting Naruto in the middle of the arena with an axe kick from above, coming down on him like a meteor. By all intents and purposes, this attack would be able to break through walls and shatter the bones of most students through their aura. So it was to Taiyang's surprise that Naruto caught his kick with a single hand. His other arm listlessly relaxed to his side. The professor then smirked, as if asking him if that was all he had. All fear lifted away from him, like a morning mist blown away by a tempest. He could do more. Taiyang could do just a bit more until his body wouldn't be able to handle the strain of his semblance any longer. But he could push even further beyond. Activating his semblance again, he ignored the strain on his muscles as they screamed at him in warning, informing him that they were in danger of tearing or straining if they were pushed any further. He knew his body the best. He could go one more boost and then his body would shut down or immediately reset his semblance. That being the case, he'd have to utilize this opportunity to attack as his last chance to PR. Ove to himself and to this professor that he was more than simply a student at Beacon. He was a promising prospect for a huntsman. "Here I come," Taiyang roared, jumping away from the professor, who did nothing to hold onto his ankle. The moment he landed, he cracked the earth and burst forth like lightning, thunderclapping after he disappeared. At this point, he was far faster than the speed that Summer had shown. The issue was that he himself had difficulty keeping up with this speed. But it mattered not, as his target was directly in front of him. He'd reach him in only a tenth of a second. All he'd have to do is put his arm in front of him in the form of a punch and the momentum would do the rest. It happened all at once. First, then were a sudden crack in the air, as two energies came into each other and clashed. Tai Yang's fist met Naruto's open palm, and the sound of the clash echoed like a sonic boom, exploding loudly. Then, a gust of wind caught up to Tai Yang and blew past Naruto, forcing the hair of the professor back. The professor's eyes were completely clear of the bangs, and the student was able to see the smile slowly crinkling up to his lips and the way his eyes narrowed with the expression of content and happiness. And finally, without Tai Yang even able to see the counter, the professor spun and kicked Tai Yang in the side of the head with his heel, knocking the older blonde away from him and out of the arena. With that, 30% of his aura was immediately knocked off, and the arena's system blared, alerting the combatants and the students that Tai Yang had reached the red. Ow! Tai Yang mumbled, uneasy as he attempted to overcome the vertigo. He crunched up and stood, wobbled for a moment, and then leaned against the arena with his arms and looked up at the professor. Did you really have to kick me that hard? Naruto shrugged. You let your guard down. If you protected yourself with aura, that would have mitigated the force of the blow quite a bit. He smiled. But good job. You improved quite well in only a month. Tai Yang beamed at the compliment and grinned widely. You'll receive critiques and notes later. But for now, I'll again say that you did well for what you've learned. Just make sure to keep training hard to increase your base strength. After all, it would do well for you and your semblance, Datbeo. Tai Yang nodded, understanding clearly what Naruto meant. With that, he turned away and walked towards the stands. His semblance. Naruto hadn't even been surprised when he began to use it. He was hoping for at least some kind of reaction. But it was without a doubt that the professor knew what his semblance was. After all, he was a professor, so he probably knew what every student's semblance was. He walked up the stairs and rejoined his teammates. He failed to notice the general shift in perspective that the other students looked at him. He was in a new light. But at the same time, he had given the professor a spotlight to portray how skilled he was at hand-to-hand. No one would be able to match him, and Raven noticed this. By the time he was sitting, Raven was fuming in her seat. That professor, he was holding back against her so much this entire time. And here she thought that she had seen improvement over the course of the last month. She stewed over the subject at hand, inwardly frustrated that Professor Naruto was that much stronger than what she had expected. And here, she thought she had been catching up, slowly but surely. But Tai Yang's little show is the first spar, which was more than what she could muster at this point in time, showed that she was far from reaching the level that she wanted to. After all, her goal was the professor himself. To become stronger than he was. And the bar had just been set so much higher than it previously was. Wow, you did so well. Summer exclaimed to the shell-shocked Tai Yang. The blonde teammate hardly registered what she said. He seemed to be in a sort of a daze. Stuck in a trance after having been complimented by the professor on his improvement and effort in the training. Ah, thank you, was the listless response. Summer took no mind to that and chattered along. I didn't know you could move so quickly. You're almost as fast as I am. Kiro blinked. Almost as fast. Wasn't Tai Yang clearly moving much faster than she was in the team battle? Did that mean she was even faster than what Tai Yang had just shown? What kind of unbalanced team are we? Kiro muttered to himself. Something about their team composition and the general skill expression and power level already set him as something odd. They were far stronger than the normal squad of 4. Far stronger. In what world did their team make sense? Kiro turned his head to set his gaze on Ozpin. The inquisitive headmaster as calm and still as ever. Whatever was going through that man's head, it didn't quite sit with him in a settling way. He had been a student of Beacon for little over a month. And he had no doubt now that each of the 4 of them were easily top of their class. If not consecutively top 4 students, then at least in the top 10. And that was considering the over 100 students that had been accepted into the academy. Usually, a team's balance was considered based on one's personality and also their general skill sets. Aura manipulation skills were greatly considered as well. Surprisingly, Beacon did not care too much for semblances for balancing out teams. In that regard, they were the opposite of Atlas. According to Professor Naruto, Beacon prided itself on creating well-functioning teams that worked primarily off of experience and lots of training. Any team that had graduated from Beacon would be able to take on many challenges, see a NY situation through as best as they were able to, capably finish a mission even without one of their members available. That was the kind of teams that Beacon created. Units that were easily NGEABLE and smoothly swapping if the time required it, and doing so with no real difficulty. But of course, teams always preferred their original teams. And also understandably, they performed the best with their teams. It is with this information in consideration that the first team that is made, which is usually permanent in the long term, is so important. Teams that were strong usually last together for years. And the stronger they were, the longer they lasted. It was simple. And over time, they built up a bank of experience so large that it was rather unheard of to hear members fall after being in the field for over 20 years. So Kiro had to ask, why were their teams skewed in such a way that they would be falling into that category? What did Ozpin have to gain for it? It was clear had he wanted them to stay in the future, that much he could garner with ease. But for what? Don't bother with that. Raven's eyes slimmed and her orbs darkened to a bloody red. It doesn't matter if our team is strong if there is someone out there clearly stronger. She said this looking pointedly at the professor, and the other three in the team felt a chill run down their spines. All three knew exactly what she meant. She wanted to be as strong as Naruto, and then surpass him. Kiro understood her best. It was Raven's very nature to want to be strong. For so long, she was the strongest one in her tribe. And it was practically her identity. They both knew that coming to Beacon, they might find training huntsmen and actual huntsmen that were far more experienced and powerful than they, but not to this degree. To be so utterly meek and worthless compared to the blonde professor, this was not expected. And Kiro knew it grated on Raven's nerves to the last nerve ending. It probably wouldn't have antagonized her as much if he had been someone of similar mindset to her. That the strong survive, and that the weak remain meek and live only to serve the strong. The weak never live the life they want, and thus they are dead. Never truly living their own lives, always a slave to the whims of others. But Naruto was nothing like that. True, he was strong, and he was living the life he wanted to. But he did not seem to take the same perspective that the tribe had, and not by a long shot. In fact, there seemed to be a fundamental contrast between her tribe's mentality and the professor's mindset. And she had yet to grasp what that difference was. So far, she had been able to comprehend that he loved his job and deeply appreciated the act of teaching. Perhaps it was simply that he enjoyed helping others. And therefore that was the difference. But, no, there was something else entirely, and she couldn't place a finger on it. Until I am stronger, I won't consider my stay at Beacon a success. This time, it wasn't only her team that perked up at this. A few others that heard Raven's proclamation turned in her direction, a myriad of reactions to her absurd claim. Stupefied. None of the other students deigned to speak up. None of them even had the gall to ever think of themselves as strong as the professor anymore, and to even say so out loud with conviction was a task only one deemed insane could accomplish. Well, it was a good thing indeed that Raven was never considered normal, and that her tribe valued strength. Taiyang breathed out slowly. He's our professor. He knows all of our semblances and we don't even know his. How are you ever going to beat him? He doesn't know our semblances. Now that got the full attention of all of the students in hearing range. The professor's calling for the next student to enter the arena was completely forgotten. The professor didn't know any of their semblances. What do you mean? Taiyang's confusion was clear. He's our professor. He'd want to train our semblances, too. There's no way he doesn't know. Raven slowly shook her head. He asked me if my semblance has to do with connecting with others. Had already told me that he doesn't know what my semblance is. She had written bonds on her application to Beacon. It was close enough that she could tell anyone asking that they aren't wrong, but they weren't necessarily correct either. That's one facet of my semblance, but that isn't the application of my semblance, so that's how I know he doesn't know. She didn't care much for revealing what her semblance was. No one would be able to guess what the actual ability was unless she used it. Besides, it was unlikely that she would create any bonds with students at Beacon, so stating as much did no harm to her. Raven shrugged, tapping her bicep idly. Taiyang widened his eyes. Wait. You're telling me that he stood in the center of the arena, not at all knowing what my Lance actually did and simply defended anyway. A sickening feeling crept up his stomach. He suddenly felt a lurch and the urge to throw up. His semblance could kill others easily if it went unchecked. Especially if it was to the degree that it was against Naruto, but against an unsuspecting student. He was so sure that the professor knew, so he felt comfortable pushing his limits, and the professor was absolutely no slouch when it came to combat. But even a professor taken by surprise could be injured handily. Combo breaker. His semblance was entirely based on how long he could maintain his offense. And the longer he could keep up a combo, the stronger and faster he got. He took whatever kinetic energy from the first blow and combined it into his second, and that would be taken over into the next. It would consistently add up. And if left unchecked, became extremely lethal. However, the drawback was that once he missed an attack, he would have to start over. It was why he was so surprised at how genius, yet simple Naruto's training plan was for him was. Raise his base value in strength and speed, and this would result in a faster growth in his semblance. If you added 1 plus 1 over and over again, it would be far slower than if you added 2 by 2. Raising his base would increase how much faster and stronger he would get with each boost, so he assumed that Naruto knew exactly what his semblance was. Not really. He also told me he has a general idea of everyone's semblance already. Raven looked at Taiyang, who only looked slightly relieved at the news. Even if you had injured him, you can't forget that none of us have actually seen him lose a single digit of aura. Was he even channeling aura during your spar? No, Taiyang breathed out slowly, relief and shock both coursing through him. Naruto had not once activated his aura to strengthen himself and his body and had defended himself. That was all skill, technique, and pure power from his body. Holy shit, that's just not real. It is. And that's the goal to reach, Raven voiced resolutely, her eyes zoning in on the professor. Currently, he was locked in a spar with one of the students. The student was on the offensive. And Naruto was constantly tapping the joints and getting in the guard of the student. Over time, it became clear that what Naruto was actually doing was correcting the form of the student during the spar. How the hell he was doing it, she had no clue, but it was clear that he simply was. The form became much crisper and cleaner as the spar went on, and even the student seemed to realize what was happening. And he let it happen, constantly attacking, even when sweat saturated his forehead and matted his hair. Summer watched the spar with eyes of pure admiration. I'd like to be as strong as he is one day, too. Taiyang stared at the two women in his team with incredulity. Kiro chose to roll his eyes, but looked over to Ozpin again. The headmaster was watching the spar with a sprinkle of interest marring his eyes. I don't get it, none of the focus is on the student, but rather on the teach. No one heard him. Everyone else was too focused on the dance and performance. The professor was showing the rest of his students. Kiro's thin eyebrows dropped a level as the young huntsman in training squinted his eyes. He confirmed his suspicions. The headmaster's eyes flicked as Naruto moved. Not when the students attacked. Odd. Later, when he was called, he saw that Ozpin did actually recognize him for a moment, but the headmaster's attention was once again transfixed and the combat instructor immediately after. Kiro was handedly shut down. Although he did have to admit to himself that despite his distracted state, which the professor noticed, he did better than the majority of students. Maybe the headmaster was curious where the professor had gained such monstrous strength as well. Summer did as well as she always did, impressing the entire class with her speed and maneuvers. She was smart with her tactics, but Naruto seemed to read everything she did like a book, keeping up with her speed mentally with little difficulty. In the end, she didn't manage to reek past a single percentage from the professor, but it seemed that the professor moved with far more intent and quickness compared to when he faced the other students. That seemed to be enough for Summer. The compliment he gave her made her absolutely beam. Raven was also far beyond what the rest of the class expected. What she lacked in speed, she made up for with precision, technique, and keenness. Once again, She was able to take a single percentage off the professor, but nothing more. She accepted it for what it was, but seemed frustrated the entire fight. After the spar and even after he complimented Raven, the black-haired beauty roughly thanked him and went to her seat in the audience. At the end of the class, Naruto thanked the headmaster for coming to watch the class, and Ozpin simply returned the gesture with his own thanks for humoring his stay. He would leave after addressing the students, informing them of what he had seen. He had seen tremendous growth and a bright future ahead for this class, and hoped that the next time he visited, his vision for the first-year students would be the same. When class was dismissed, the general mood of the students was quite swell. As high as a kite. Except one individual. You were holding back this entire time against me. Naruto tore his gaze away from his scroll, which he was typing into for grades and comments for each student. He was already watching recordings of the spars and giving critiques, despite the fact that class had just ended. Naruto quirked an eyebrow as if to display confusion, but Raven felt that the emotion shown was completely done for show. I hold back against everyone. Raven's expression took a dark turn. You know what I mean, Professor. You've been holding back. She paused, unsure how to explain herself. She shook her head and swiped an arm across her chest. You've been going easy mode on top of easy against me during our spars. She felt insulted. Naruto remained silent. His blue orbs looked at her, glancing at her rapidly shifting eyes due to her tumultuous emotions. He then closed his scroll and put it away. A moment of silence passed, and he walked so that he was in front of Raven. Raven held her ground, meeting Naruto's gaze with her own. Unwilling to back down, her steel resolve still felt some reverberation due to her respect to the person in front of her. He was stronger. But still, she had to show that she was strong as well. What do you think Aura is capable of? She almost showed surprise at the question, due to its unrelated nature. However, she kept cool and answered just as coolly. It can be used as offense and defense, strengthening our bodies. Naruto nodded. And what else? Raven's pupils dilated. The professor never asked questions without meaning. What do you mean, and what else? That's what it has been known for. That's what the books have been telling us for centuries. But she felt it. Naruto knew something, and he was about to share it with her. He gave her a soft smile. Do you mind if I borrow your odachi? Raven handed it over without a moment's hesitation. She pulled the blade out of its sheath and gave it to her professor, who eyed the red blade with wonder and an appreciation for the work it was. Anyone else, she would have denied such a request, but this professor in particular did not ask for things without reason. Nor did he ever take anything for granted. This is a beautiful blade. Does it have a name? Omen. Omen. Naruto tested the name, and decided that he liked it. It has a nice ring to it. He raised the blade into the light and inspected each section, eyeing it like a professional. A black handle, with a red blade long enough to reach a target without retaliation due to its absurd reach. Usually held by one hand, and occasionally held by two as specific circumstances. Naruto lowered the blade and held it so that the head of the blade was inches from the ground. Raven held in her surprise. He was completely comfortable with her weapon, wielding it in a fashion that showed that he was versed with a weapon like hers. His stance was open, but it was a stance and the way he gripped the hand showed comfort and understanding of the weapon in his possession at the moment. You fight with an odachi as well. Naruto shook his head. My preferred weapon is actually something far more expendable. However, I am rather well versed in swords of multiple natures due to my semblance, as well as a bit of luck. Again, it was his semblance. What exactly was it? Of all of the guesses she had, nay of them actually connected to a weapon. Naruto turned away from her, and then he changed. He channeled aura, but it was different from the way she had ever seen it before. It came out in droves of yellow, swirling and spinning around him like a deadly vortex. The density of his aura was like no other, and it began to form around his body. However, instead of sticking to his form, the aura koati in him slowly shifted over to the blade in his hand. It stilled, taking shape around the blade and finding peace with its form, no longer spinning. However, there was an ear-piercing sound that began to echo, coming from her blade. Without any fanfare, the blonde nonchalantly swung the blade in a blur. The aura left Omen, flying in an arc through the air in a flash. Before she could even widen her eyes, The arc made impact against the wall of the arena and caved the structure in slightly. The building was not supposed to take damage. Raven eyed the crater on the wall as if it was an anomaly that had no right to exist in this plane. Students had missed bullets and used their semblances in combat, using it against other combatants. None of them had ever actually created so much as a cut against any surface in the room. And it wasn't supposed to. The arena was meant to be sturdy so that no stray ability would break through a wall and injure a random passerby outside. It was also meant to protect the technology inside. The fact that a single swing of the blade from nearly 100 feet away and created a crater almost 5 feet wide in diameter left her feeling very uncomfortable. But also, entirely eager. That was strength. She turned away from the impact and to her professor, who had his blue eyes on her. At that moment, she could not deny to herself that he was, no doubt, the strongest person she knew. Ozpin didn't count because she had never seen him fight. And all of the other professors, she had never been so impressed by their presence. They did nothing to hide their nature. And she found nothing to be enamored by. However, Naruto hid his true nature. At this moment, he showed a little bit of it, and it enticed her. It drew her in like nothing else. He was smiling. But it wasn't the kind smile of her professor. It was the smile of someone that knew combat and appreciated it. That knew that they were strong. And yet, his smile still held the same sentimental love for her as a student. It was a contradiction. It denied him his quest for strength. If he was training her, then he wasn't training himself. Or at least, there was less time for him available for his own growth. This fact both upset her and amazed her. He was this strong without any formal training, and everything self-learned. With this revelation, she confirmed that he was so far advanced in aura that the books could not compare. He was strong and enjoyed combat, and she loved that. But he acted so much like a professor that loved to teach. To train students so that they could go strong as well. He shared his wealth of knowledge, not at all caring for the fact that he was giving up so much time for the possibility to gain new heights in strength. She disagreed with this mentality on a fundamental level. He wasn't greedy. And she was. You love fighting. Naruto widened his eyes momentarily, but he regained his composure easily enough. He chuckled honestly and scratched the back of his head with the hand not holding the weapon. It's not so much that I love fighting. I think it's better to say that it's all I know, and that I understand combat and appreciate it for what it is. It's an art. And it is an amazing way to communicate in ways words cannot. Raven crossed her arms, not at all impressed with his answer. Fighting isn't used to replace words. Naruto seemed intrigued. It isn't. When words fail, we turn to our fists. When we cannot say any more, our hands do the talking for us. And sometimes, combat helps each person understand the other. Why are they fighting? What are they fighting for? What are their beliefs? All of this comes from our very being when we fight, and we express ourselves with our body when our words cannot. You don't seem convinced. But let me give you an example that is rather base level. The Faunus fight back against the government and the people that discriminate against them. They use words, but sometimes words fail. Sometimes, words cannot be used. They fight. You can tell from that fight how enraged a Faunus is, but also their character. Perhaps you can see their rage at the system, because it isn't directed at you. You can tell that this particular Faunus is blinded by his rage due to the inequality, and therefore blindly attacks everything in sight. Or another Faunus is relatively peaceful, only fighting because she believes her cause to be just and right. Each scenario is different, and words can give you an idea of a person. But so can action. And actions tend to speak louder. Anyone can understand another person. And at a fundamentally base level through their actions, and fighting is no different. However, at a high enough level, you can actually understand each other at a much deeper level. Raven still seemed unimpressed. Then why can't I understand you? Naruto eyed her, and then openly laughed. That's because you simply aren't strong enough. Get stronger and fight me in 5 years, and maybe you'll begin to understand me at a deeper level. Quote. It wasn't an insult. He was simply telling her the way he viewed it. The way he saw the situation. But she disagreed. 2 years. I'll be strong enough to take you down to a knee with your aura active, she promised. She thinned her lips resolutely. There was a lull in the world as the two stared at each other, one in resolute determination, and the other in calm kindness. I suppose if you could do that, it would be enough. He held out her blade for her. She took it and resheathed it. But you have quite a ways to go if you want to be able to do that. Again, it wasn't an insult. It was clear how large of a gap there was between him and her. Perhaps learning more about aura manipulation would do you wonders. It would, she said easily. Naruto smiled. I'm surprised that you asked about my character before asking what ability I had just shown or what my semblance was. He seemed pleased. She turned her head away, a light red dusting her cheeks. I know you wouldn't have told me your semblance anyway. And I want to figure it out for myself. Besides, you would tell me the ability you just showed me eventually. I'd rather understand why. You're strong than how you became strong. Your existence and the way you live are simply too contradictory. So I had to ask. He laughed at her reasonable response, mouth wide open as his head tilted back in his amusement. True, he said, confirming her expectations. I could explain it to you, but why should I play favorites and show you alone when I could explain it to the rest of the students? He took Raven's silence as her answer. Then again, there's nothing stopping me from answering a question from a student that asked a question, so I'll explain some things to you. If you have a person, and you say that, aura enhances the body, both in defense and offense, what do you think of? A coating, a layer around our body. Sometimes, we can channel it to specific parts if we have extremely good control of our aura. Naruto nodded. True. When they have good control, some of them are able to spread their aura to their feet only, or to their hands. But aura is an energy that we extend as a channel. And I want to remind you that it extends outside of our body. Raven recalled when he summoned his aura and it came out swirling in a startling vortex. It's versatile beyond what people think of. For example, if I channel aura to a piece of my hair, what happens? Raven watched in silence as the blonde pulled out a single string of blonde hair from his root and a yellow glow surrounded the hair. It strained and grew taut, straightening and extending to full length. He held up the hair to his eye level, inspected it for a moment, and then looked back at Raven. A hair's constitution is not very resilient nor durable. However, you could think of it as a glass cannon. If I threw this right now, I'd probably be able to pierce the wall. What it lacks in destructive property, it now makes up for in piercing capability. Quote, wait. Raven couldn't hold in her excitement, but also how much of an issue this brought up. If that was the case, wouldn't everyone have to be considerably more careful during international events? Or when politicians meet other politicians from other kingdoms, there'd be way more security, wouldn't there? If a hair could kill someone, then wouldn't the guards and such have to be bald? Naruto imagined it for a moment, found the thought hilarious, and laughed at the idea of Ozpin with a shining dome. I'd love to see the headmaster with that kind of getup. But no, that isn't the case. The reason is, he brought a finger up to his lips, and smirked slightly, because no one is capable of this ability other than me. First, think how difficult it is for someone to channel aura throughout their body in an efficient manner. Now, think about how much harder it is to use that aura and utilize it in specific parts of your body. That's already something that most people train for years to obtain. He smirked at her, and she felt goosebumps travel up her crossed arms. Now, I want you to think how difficult it is to be able to extend aura outside of your body. To change the composition of an object by injecting your energy through that object. To strengthen the constitution of a sword, a bullet, or a piece of hair, these are considered impossible tasks by everyone in this world. That's what the books will tell you. Then, why are you able to do it? The more Raven heard, the more she felt that she was not talking to a normal teenager. It frightened her, antagonized her, enriched her, excited her, aroused her. It made her feel so many different emotions all at once, because she didn't know how to feel or think about this professor in front of her. Simply put, he was a different breed that she so badly wanted to unlock the puzzle for, but didn't have all the pieces available to complete regardless. It left her frustrated and always wanting more. Because I'm in tune with my soul. If everyone in the world knew that this was possible, then I'm sure that eventually, a few people would pop up capable of what I am. But here's the thing. These are the more basic of applications that I am capable of. True, I can't make fire or wind out of nothing, but I can use dust as a catalyst to create flames that would make a pyromaniac blush. The thing is, Glinda has the highest aura affinity of the 4th years, but even she can't even get her hair to straighten, much less set fire to dust the way I can." Raven stared at her professor, unnerved. In front of her was possibly the most versatile person on Remnant. She had realized quite a while ago that Naruto was strong, but to what degree? This explanation answered far more than she had expected. And possibly wanted. Forget 4 years. If Glinda wasn't even close to his level of understanding aura, then she was screwed. In battle, knowledge was extremely vital. If one side lacked critical information, such as the abilities of the other opposing end, then the one with the lack of information was always at a disadvantage. Because Raven would never know fully what Naruto was capable of. Then he'd always have an advantage over her in combat. "You're strong, right?" The way the question was phrased was clearly not meant to be taken literally. Naruto caught on and smiled. "I'm strong enough to protect the things that matter to me." What a typical answer from him. Raven looked away from his eyes and set her gaze on the wall that had been crushed inwards from a swipe of her sword. There was no way she could accomplish a feat like what he had done. "How many people what you're capable of?" Raven asked. His answer honestly scared her. "Nobody knows what I'm capable of. And personally, I'd like to keep it that way. It means that it was never necessary to show what I can do." For the first time in her life, she was glad somebody was genuinely on the side of humanity and was a good person. She couldn't see Naruto against the goodwill of the world. The thought felt too hollow and unreal. "Does Glinda know?" "Of course." How did she respond? "Because I don't know how to feel about this information." She said, "Okay, I believe you, without really believing me." Raven's eyes met Naruto's. "But she believes you now." He grinned, a beautiful smile stretching across his lips. "As much as people on Remnant believe that the moon is shattered." It was a still, cold night. Winter was quickly approaching, and the slow chill of the night came unrelenting. It was always on the horizon. But during the night, the frigid air came like an onslaught, quickly claiming the land and covering it like a blanket made of ice. Near the clearing that the combat instructor normally held office hours, Raven was swinging her Odachi, attempting to channel her aura into her blade and create an aura arc that would extend from her blade into the air. She was there for nearly 2 hours, slicing her sword through the air without break, not even having stopped for dinner due to her concentration. Despite her efforts, however, her blade would not even shine with the slightest glimmer. A far cry from the way it burned bright in the hands of her professor. Footfalls to her left alerted her of another presence. She turned and caught Glinda walking over to her. The upperclassman was dressed in a casual outfit, a stark contrast from the regal and upright presence she normally exuded. A blue hoodie with strings hanging listlessly with pockets for her hands, and black jeans that comfortably fitted her legs. "He showed you." Raven turned her head to face forwards and swung her blade again, channeling all of her aura into her hands. At least, she attempted to. He aura in her body coated her in a thin sheen and quickly coalesced around her hands, but it did not do so cleanly. Instead of concentrating in her palms in a neat manner, it revolved sporadically and violently near her arms. And only a smidgen of her aura actually traveled up the blade. When she swung Omen, the only arc that left it was a slice of air. She breathed deeply, frustration having long since left. Now, she only kept swinging her blade with a single intent, a trance having taken over her mind. However, the direct approach from Glinda and her question broke her out of her shell. Sweat dripped down her forehead. She realized that her entire body felt hot as her clothes clung to her body due to the moisture. Thankfully, the night was cool, but it also had the rather unwelcome court of feeling far too cold against the sweat. Raven realized that she would have to call it a night soon. She could possibly catch a cold. He did. She sheathed her blade into the giant revolver chom beer and placed it against the tree next to her. Glinda stepped closer so that she was beside Raven, looking at the same scenery. The two of them looked out into the open expanse of land outside of the walls of Beacon. Beyond the fences and walls. In the night, it was an endless land with silhouettes of mountains and ridges. Suddenly, Glinda spoke. "You know, I thought you'd be here." "He didn't have office hours today and sent us a message. He told us that he was talking to a student in his combat class." It was rather easy to narrow down who he could be talking to, especially after he cancelled office hours for today. And the subject of the matter became rather apparent after watching you swing the blade with a certain goal in mind. Raven remained silent. Glinda shifted her glasses and turned her eyes up to the sky above. When he first showed his base abilities to me, I thought that it was unfair. Why was it that Professor Uzumaki is able to do all of these things at a younger age, but I am unable to accomplish even half of the things he is able to do? Thoughts like that negatively plagued my mind. I realized that it affected my performance in class and my concentration in classes were reduced, to my embarrassment. So I decided that I would do what I could during my other classes, put all of my focus on myself and my growth. I began to attend his office hours, trained on my own every day, took care of my body, and practiced my semblance every single day for an hour at minimum. Thanks to our professor, I can honestly say that I'm the top of my class by a rather large margin. The taller blonde paused, her green gems reflecting the image of the moon. An aura of pride emerged, but was quickly whiffed away, stolen in the wind. But I wasn't satisfied, so I decided that I would be his assistant. That way, I could be near him for the majority of the day outside of classes. I could analyze his schedule, see how he trained, and hopefully utilize this information to catapult my growth once more. What I learned appalled me. He trains less than I did. Glinda's smile returned, amusement filling her face as memories came into mind. In fact, the majority of his time was spent analyzing footage during combat class and writing critiques for every student. For a good portion of the day, he'd stare at paper with a blank expression. When I joined him, he would talk to me instead of completing the work on his desk. This time, she didn't stop the giggle, finding clear humor in the situation. When I offered to help, he would spend the time given to him by meditating. I was upset, but decided to take a scientific approach and attempt it myself. After all, it was an observation, and all that would be necessary to check this strange hypothesis of mine was an experiment. So I meditated. The meditation helped me tap into my aura to a level one hadn't known was possible in such a short period of time. Something that would have taken me over a decade, he helped me realize within a year. Glinda pulled out a string of her hair and channeled aura into her right hand. Slowly, the hair caught between her pointer finger and thumb straightened until it was ramrod stiff. Suddenly, she threw the hair at a tree about 20 feet away. Raven nearly dropped her jaw as it pierced through nearly 3 feet of trunk, and then the rock behind the tall tree. "You can do it, Rav." N couldn't stop the surprise in her voice, her eyes lighting up. Glinda allowed a small smile to grace her lips. "I can do it partially. I can pierce 3 large trees in succession if we went to the forest that held the initiation. But our professor can pierce through at least 20 of them." Raven breathed in sharply. That kind of destructive power was already bordering unstoppable. "Do you still feel that it's unfair?" Glinda looked away from the carnage she had created and her green orbs caught onto Raven's red gleam. "I don't." "Why not? Don't you want to be as strong as he is?" The blonde's smile took a mature edge. "I'm sure you realize this, but you asking the question of whether or not I wish to be as powerful as our professor admits that he is stronger than we are." Raven slowly accepted that to be true. She came to realize that as a fact rather early on, but accepting it took a bit longer. Once I accepted that significant detail as a fact, it was rather simple for me to accept other things that came with it. But the one thing that I have to be most appreciative of is the fact I became thankful that he even allowed me to enter his world. I can tell myself that I won. Go out into the world as a huntsman that will have to fill into the shoes and expectations of a huntsman, but rather one that is stronger than the majority of currently active huntsmen in the 4 kingdoms. He taught me how to look at the world in a different way, and how anything can be applied to a subject if I take a certain perspective. He may not be the smartest tool in the shed when it comes to logistics and paperwork. But he is the best when it comes to unorthodox approaches and unpredictable thoughts about aura and combat. He trusted me enough to show me a bit of his ability and life. And I've grown because of it at an extraordinary rate. Now, he's shown you, because he trusts you as well. He believes you can grow as well, and I do, too. In the soft moonlight, and the frigid air, Glinda's mature smile was possibly one of the most captivating images Raven had ever seen in her lifetime. It was worthy of a still capture that would be saved in her scroll for decades if she could have taken a shot in that very moment. But the moment was short-lived. "Why do you two trust me so much? I have to go back to my tribe one day." Glinda looked at the girl in front of her and saw someone teetering on the edge between two sides of her conscience. Somehow, the usually calm and brash first year seemed concerned and uncomfortable with the trust she was given. It was as if she wanted to run away, so as not to deal with the responsibility of this expectation that both she and her professor had placed on her shoulders. Raven eyed her sword, the one constant in her life. No matter what, it would never betray her. The sword never fails the user, but only the wielder fails the blade. It was a relationship that was far simpler than that between her and her brother, and especially Aya. Easier to comprehend than the bond that Glinda and Naruto were trying to create with her. She felt her walls caving as she unconsciously slowly let them in, her hands figuratively reaching out to them without even noticing. You realize that the first thing you did when you learned about his secret was train. Anyone that has a one-track mind towards strength and actually listens to our professor can't be a bad person. After all, you trust him, even if you don't quite realize it. Therefore, he trusts you. And he does not trust blindly. Glinda lifted something off the ground from a few meters away, and brought it in front of her so that Raven could clearly see it. It was a large cup of water, the cup clearly taken from the cafeteria. Glinda gestured to it, and Raven took it with two hands, Glinda gratefully and drinking from the source greedily. Besides, I trust you because you are too honest, and your emotions show clearly. Your actions are all based on how you feel. Glinda's tender, our smile came into full display as the moon escaped the loose grip of a few stray clouds. And from what I've surmised, you're a good person. Raven's red orbs analyzed her sword. After a few moments of silence between the two, with only the night's zephyr to alert them of the passing time, she looked up again at Glinda. I still don't get it. Even if I'm a good person, why would he show it to me? Not to the fourth years who are going to be huntsmen soon. They probably have a much better grasp on aura than I do, and they're going to be fighting the Grimm. And possibly other people. The F.A. Court that she was from a tribe in the outskirts of civilization that routinely stole from villages was a detail not lost on her. But even she had a conscience. It wasn't about completely raiding a town of all of its value. Otherwise, there was no reason for them to stay in a location, they had to leave enough for the town to pick up on her feet and start over again. But sadly, killing was not uncommon. People fought people all the time. That was human nature. She had no doubts that people would fight others as long as humanity existed. But at the very least, this increase in firepower for humankind would result in the Grimm lowering in risk potential. You ask the same questions I did, but the answer is rather obvious. You're probably thinking that the benefits for humanity outweigh the potential pitfalls this boon presents. Am I correct? Glinda nodded when she caught Raven's expression. And you think that the Grimm would be on the background, as humanity would be in the forefront of all risks. We'd live in a utopia where humanity would be the only worry, as greed and pride would be our downfall in the future, and not the Grimm. Glinda's face changed so it was forlorn and solemn. Professor Uzumaki only had to tell me one word, so I'll do the same for you. If you're like me, you'd understand. Glinda breathed in, remembering the face her professor made when she spoke the word. It was calm, but underneath the ocean orbs of his, lapping with relative consistency and comfort, was a raging turbulence that none could survive. His entire body was tense, and she held herself back from grabbing onto his hand to let him know that it was all right. After all, he wasn't alive when it happened, he was too young. But his eyes and body betrayed something to her, because it seemed like all other things that he shouldn't know, he understood this as well. Yet he was young, but was aware of the horrors of it. War. Raven felt at a loss. How could she not think of this? There was no doubt that the professor had already thought about the potential of teaching his students, that was all he did every day for as long as he could. He no doubt considered how the information would spread to the other kingdoms. And that the Grimm would be mere fodder compared to the increased strength of the huntsman. But, it appears her professor was more of a realist than she had expected, and had won the route of not sharing his knowledge. So, the answer he chose was to not share so that humanity would always be afraid of the Grimm. I can't say I particularly agree with his decision. I don't want to live in fear of Grimm for the rest of my life. Glinda looked at her hand, open palm up to the sky. I'm more afraid of people that could utilize this strength. Humans are innovative, and we evolve based on our conditions. If we didn't have Grimm as a common enemy, then all that'd be left are humans. We had multiple wars in history, even with Grimm present as a prominent force. If you gave these people power, what would happen? She clenched her fist and looked at Raven. You give Faunus access to this power, would they be as peaceful? How about the retaliatory force from those against Faunus gaining equal rights? Would they be peaceful, either? You want both humanity to be strong and for it to be in unison, despite its history of discontent and tension. Even though we are currently in a time of relative peace. Can you truly tell yourself that there aren't people in the shadows with machinations that wish to tear down this peace we live in? Or that they want to revel in the Oshiti we have now while juicing out the fat from the loopholes present in our current system? Society is not perfect, and neither are people. In my opinion, gifting this knowledge to everybody in the world would head us to a war that could potentially wipe out the majority of the world's population. Raven shook her head. But Naruto is our professor. If he was the one to teach everyone, would dispute him. Also, how many people in the world are strong enough to fight him? Glinda looked at her, and then pointed her finger at Raven. Raven lifted an eyebrow, unsure what that was supposed to mean. Professor Uzumaki cares about us. Once again, Raven felt her world shatter. It was because she realized, twice in one day, that she knew so little of the world around her. First, Naruto made her realize that she had no deep comprehension of aura and how to manipulate it. And now, she came to realize that Naruto worried that if information spread about the fact he knew how to manipulate aura to such a level that was incomprehensible and unable to be recreated, then they would come for him. They, as in other humans, are faunus that want to gain that knowledge for their own purposes, and not for the future of humanity. After all, Naruto would no doubt be careful with who he spread his understanding of aura to. The problem is, when they were rejected, there was the possibility that some wouldn't give up from there. They would go after those he deemed precious. He told Meihe's strong enough to protect those he cares about. Raven felt like she was grasping at straws. Everything she said, she hardly believed herself. But she said it anyway, if only to hear what rebuttal Glinda had. Glinda dropped her hand to her side and smiled sadly. He already lost students. Raven went into her room quickly, shutting the door behind her quietly without looking. She ignored the questioning look from her brother, and she held in her displeasure when Taiyang and Summer discussed their grades Professor Naruto and the critiques they gave them. Apparently, the two of them both did well. Taiyang got a B, and Summer got a solid A. Raven didn't have the heart to read the message Naruto sent her, containing her grade for the month and analysis for her progress as well as how she could improve from her on out. Not after tonight. She went straight for the closet to grab her sleepwear and walked quickly to the bathroom. Not hearing Summer and Taiyang call out for her to see how she did on the combat class. When the door shut, the two of them looked over to her brother, but he only gave them a shrug. Even he didn't know. A few seconds later, the shower turned on. Mist built up in the bathroom, and steam took over. Raven stepped inside the shower, caring not for the hot droplets barraging her naked skin. Her feelings were all muted. All except shame. She couldn't remember the last time she cried. But her hot tears were hidden by the shower. For the first time in years, she felt shame. She realized that she was weak. Dawn arose, its blissful and serene arms gracefully wrapping over the land and giving its touch to each section of the lush earth. The grass swayed softly, basking and the gentle touch of the sun's rays on its tips, greeting the morning with veritable comfort. As the light rose more and reached the campus of Beacon, students remained asleep for the most part. No alarms went off, and there was practically no foot traffic in the dawn of Saturday. Strangely, Summer was the first to wake up. It was an odd affair, she thought to herself. She had opened her eyes, and felt wide awake. Despite the fact that Professor Naruto's class had left her sore and ragged at the end of the yesterday. And yet, when she sat up in bed, she felt completely rested and recovered by the prior day's training exercises. Every other weekend before this, she had been in bed until noon, sore and exhausted even with aura regeneration taking care of her body and muscles. She dressed herself and decided that she may as well fill her stomach. Not even Raven was awake, an oddity considering that normally, the older sibling of the Bronwyns was usually the first up of the four, and by a large margin at that. And yet, there she was, her ruby red eyes hidden beneath her closed lids, Raven's breathing calm and relaxed as her chest rose and fell in wave-like crests. Donning a pair of R-Ed shorts and a white t-shirt with red stripes down the side, she confirmed that she looked fine to explore the campus without turning any attention due to her apparel and opened the door to the dorm hallway. The first thing that struck her was that it was finally starting to feel like fall, and that meant that winter was coming. The air felt as if it had minuscule molecules of ice in it, frigidity warmly embracing each atom. Summer let out a breath that pushed out a cloud of cold air. Her hair whipped softly in the wind, and she wished that she had grabbed her cape. At least it would provide some superficial warmth, even if it couldn't help protect her legs. But for some reason, she never turned back to her room and kept walking. Something was tugging at her instinct, and she never felt the need to deny that part of her. After all, it had never failed her before, and she had the expectation that her instincts would lead her to something that would provide a new experience for her, as it had done so many times before. Ah, just the person I was thinking about. I'm surprised, considering that you're usually never awake until the afternoon though, Summer. The surprise came in the form of Professor Naruto, who was standing next to the doors outside of the library with a book in his hands, his eyes perusing the text quickly. His blue orbs were completely transfixed on the words written in the thick volume. And she found herself staring at his eyes that were seen through the transparent reading glasses he had put on for the occasion. What was more interesting, however, was the large amount of paint he had besides him. She stared at it, and it was towering above her. Hundreds upon hundreds of canisters of paint laid on the ground and on top of each other. There was no doubt in her mind that it was enough to completely provide a makeover for the entire campus of Beacon. His eyes lifted from the book, and she froze. He smiled brightly, closing the book without a thought. He had little doubt that he already memorized the spot in his text. He seemed to have an uncanny skill for memorization. You were thinking about me, she finally said, trying her best to not misinterpret what her professor had just said. Her professor nodded firmly, his smile never shifting. In fact, it seemed to widen even more. You see, I'm in a bit of a dilemma. I was given a job to complete. And it was supposed to be done by today, actually. All of this paint was supposed to cover the entire campus and change the color so that when the vital festival came around, everyone would be surprised. Lo and behold, we're only weeks away from the festivities, and the surprise is nowhere to be seen. Summer's eyes widened more and more as Naruto explained, and her mouth was agape at the end of it. She broke her gaze from Naruto, only to find the towering buckets of paint staring right back at her. So, why haven't you started on that yet? She asked, pointing at the monstrosity with emphasis. Suddenly, she narrowed her eyes. Were you expecting for Glinda to help you, and you focused on grading papers and planning the curriculum? To his credit, Naruto only let his left eye twitch. To Summer's credit, however, that was all she needed. Her eyes slimmed even further, and the disbelief came out of her in droves. I'll offer you a free meal in Vale. Summer thought about it seriously. Clearly, the trade was not worth it, and it was more of her doing her professor a favor, if anything. However, it was her professor offering her a meal in Vale, of which he had not specified. Also, it was one-on-one time with her favorite teacher, who was younger than her. It would be less similar to teacher and student and more like two friends going out for a quick hangout, if anything. A meal at Vale of my choosing and new ammunition for my side. Naruto didn't even hesitate to nod at her compromise. A gigantic smile broke out of Summer's face, previously hard and serious. You have 2 hours. She blitzed over to the buckets, hardly a blur as an afterimage of her standing still faded away. I'll only need 30 minutes if I'm serious. Do it before Ozpin comes to check up on me. And I'll even give a batch of cookies that I'll make. Summer had heard Raven talk about Naruto's cooking once. The topic had come into passing through a question. Summer was curious why Raven woke up so early in the mornings. And the black-haired girl mentioned something about meeting the professor. At first, she thought that it had meant extra training, but Raven had clarified that it was actually because Naruto offered her meals if she woke up early enough to meet him and Glinda for breakfasts. At first, Summer was tempted, but she had to disagreeably realize that she was not at all a morning individual. So she decided to ask, instead of joining them for breakfast and finding out herself, how was his cooking. I woke up for it. Enthusiasm rising, Summer burst away, and in a matter of seconds. The library was already splattered completely with color. A few seconds later, it was cleanly painted over, the splatters all brushed away neatly. It was in silent awe that Naruto watched the campus transform before him to colors of purple and pink and bright yellow. Indeed, festival colors. The trees, previously at peace with the campus green, earthly tones, took on a far more vibrant and different feel with the brighter mixes. Something about it reminded Naruto of a Candyland. It was colorful and still beautiful, but it lacked the natural charm that the original campus decor had. He let the thought pass and picked up his book, starting off from where he had left off. In the blink of an eye, half an hour had passed and he'd put his book down to a completely transformed campus. Summer stood in front of him, panting but smiling proudly, her red hair swaying slightly with each proud breath. Naruto pulled down his glasses to look around him, having stood to get a glimpse of the new look. But he wanted a better vantage point to get a better view, so he turned to Summer with an arm out and said, "Hold on tight." Summer only hesitated for a second before latching onto his extended arm. And Naruto dipped and pushed off the ground, scaling the 100-foot library in a single jump. Summer noticed that they jumped the exact height of the building, the two scarcely inches above the roof when Naruto stepped onto land. When she let go off his arm, Summer couldn't help but look straight at the back of her professor. "You're really our professor. The one that everyone held in high regard and never failed the expectations of his students when it came to combat." He was by far the most noticed and also questioned individual on the Beacon campus. After all, as students of combat, they had a lot of inquiries for the combat instructor. And time again, Professor Naruto showed why he was given the position, but he always surprised the students with each new feat he revealed that he was capable of. The unnatural control and ease of which he carried not only himself, but her as well, and accounted for the additional weight and landing with perfect accuracy was only something that could be reached with pure talent at his age. She knew that she was considered a talented individual. To even enter Beacon as a student mandated that one had skill, hard work ethic, and talent in the first place. Protectors of Humanity was not a title given lightly, and talentless students usually did not find entry into any of the combat schools once middle school passed. No principal would want the risk of taking on a student that could potentially find death out in the fields. True, the possibility always existed, but why take on the additional, extra percentages? Naruto turned to Summer with a grin, humor flashing like a gem in his eyes. "I do believe I am your professor, and the rest of the first years." "Yes, I think so." Summer couldn't help but laugh at the professor's dry humor. Half giggling and half catching her breath from the earlier exertion. She had used her semblance quite a bit, and it was taking a toll on her body. But all in all, it was good training. With the additional prize of hanging out with her professor. Seriously, how many students would wish that they could hang out with their professor? Almost no teacher was as cool as Professor Naruto, she'd bet. When he smiled at her as she laughed and then shifted his gaze so that he could get a good look at the campus, she really couldn't stop the feeling that slowly spread from her chest. The one that gave her so much. And helped her to realize that she had no reason to have no confidence. He had pride in her as a student and in her growth, and she took that pride and used it to further herself, and in turn. The professor's pride only seemed to grow. She appreciated the sincere professor. "It's quite breathtaking, isn't it?" Naruto's voice struck her out of her trance. She glanced over, and caught herself in a web. Unable to break her gaze. "That's what you did. Take pride in the fact that you did this, and no one else helped you." They stood closer to the sky, birds flitting and wheeling above them while life on Beacon went on below them. They were in the middle of it all, with no one to bother them except each other. Everything else felt so small in comparison. It was also quiet. No one ever looked up. The early risers were turning around, taking in the spectacle that was the campus with its new colors, and they did tilt their chins up to bask in the view. But not a single one of them craned their neck up to look to the roofs. So Summer stood at the edge of the library, hardly even worried about falling from the height. She could handle it, and if something happened, he had no doubt that her professor would prevent anything from happening. "I think the other students like it," she said. "Trust me," he started with a chuckle. "They love it." A quick wind picked up Summer's hair, combing through it softly. The red highlights in her hair began to glow in the slow rise of the sun. I'm curious, Professor. If you could jump up here so quickly with ease, wouldn't T's whole painting job have been a breeze for you? After all, you're able to keep up with me in class when I'm moving as fast as I can during our spars. A quizzical eyebrow rose. You think because I see and follow you with my eyes that I can travel as quickly as you can? Naruto chuckled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head when Summer leveled him with a stare. I mean, I'm not saying that I couldn't have done the job. But probably not as quickly nor as efficiently as you could have. Summer did not let the fact that he said, probably, by. But she said nothing of it and pushed it into the folders for her to bring up at a later date if it ever required it. Anyway, I'm about to head down and grab a cup of coffee. It's a bit early in the day, so some sustenance would do us some good. Would you like to join me in Vale? A vigorous nod was his response. The two arrived in Vale by Bullhead in between the end of dawn and the breaking of early morning. Stores were beginning to open, and of the citizens in the city were opening their doors to take a morning stroll or prepare for the day. Every one of the residents in each area they walked through recognized the professor. Most of them would wave or give him their greetings, to which her professor would amicably respond and smile widely. There were also plenty that stared at him with scorn, eyes full of fury and smoldering discrimination. Summer had half a mind to pull out her scythe the first time it occurred, but then she remembered that she left it in her locker at Beacon. A few seconds after, she recognized that she honestly moved to defend her professor rather than wonder why some people would even find fault with her professor in the first place. She felt insulted and upset by the fact that some people would even have issues with him. But she realized that perhaps she didn't understand the full story. Mulling in her thoughts, Summer failed to notice that the two were standing in the middle of one of the city squares, surrounded by restaurants and stores aplenty. Lifting her eyes, she caught the sight of one of her regular spots, but that was something more for dinner and for an enjoyable time with friends. Today, it was early in the morning that she left for the city. In fact, it was the earliest she had awoken in the weekend in years. And for it, she got to have a meal with her professor and got favors. Sounds like she had amazing luck this morning. Since I've invited you, you can choose anything you'd like. Coffee doesn't change much between each store unless you go to the one a few blocks away. Then it gets quite fantastic. Summer's eyes brightened at the prospect of trying one specific breakfast spot that had been all the talk as of late. It had blown up and spread through everyone's notifications on the scroll. And she had been itching to taste their menu's best. It seems like you chose. Indeed, I have, she responded happily, nodding as she marched forward to her destination. It was a tall, modern building with glass doors and windows spanning the entire length of the first floor. It had a wide, expansive floor that allowed for plenty of tables with an excessive amount of space between each table. Everything about it screamed excessive, in fact. The waiters were dressed in the most expensive, finely tailored clothing. The china that the restaurant showcased must have been more than what a modest worker could buy from a month's time of honest work. Summer hesitated. She knew that she had her professor promise that he would pay whatever the cost, but this may have been pushing it. Then again, it was known for its breakfast and brunch, so it couldn't be that expensive. Right. Would you like to come inside, Miss Rose and Professor Uzumaki? Summer started when the waiter in front of the door opened it and greeted them by name. Both of them. Specifically, the fact that he recognized her was what almost made her take a step back. The waiter, a moderate-sized male with bright eyes and an equally shining smile spread across his face, held the door as she held her silence. That'd be wonderful, Naruto finally spoke, matching the young man's charm with his own. Summer broke out of her freeze when the blonde passed through the doors, leaving the waiter to hold the door for her. She squeaked a quick, "Thank you," and squeezed through the doors. They were seated within seconds, as another waiter would pick them up and take them to a table. Looking around, Summer realized that there were only a few customers, but all of them were dressed lavishly. It was only she and her professor that were donning clothes that were more to the likeness of the common folk. Or a huntsman. For a few moments, she felt self-conscious, but when she was about to bring it up as a conversation just for the sake of conversation, she noticed her professor smiling warmly at her, He had a cup of tea in his hand, the steam lazily wafting across his face. Something about that eye felt so serene and peaceful that Summer didn't want to break it by saying that she felt awkward. So she said nothing, forcing herself to smile as she picked up the cup of tea that she hadn't even noticed the waiter place in front of her. You know, this place is actually quite nice. Summer perked up. It is rather lavish, but it is quiet and spacious, two traits that I enjoy immensely. Summer leaned forward. I thought you liked noise. After all, you make all of us yell during the sets. That's because if I don't do that, all I'd hear is the majority of you all complaining about how difficult it all is. Summer giggled at that. It was true, the first day, all that could be heard from the combat class of freshmen were groans of pain. I'm not saying that I am uncomfortable in settings that have many people. But when your job, which basically aligns with your life's goal, surrounds you with people every day, there are days where I wish to turn to quiet. That's actually why I love the morning and the night. But if that's the case, wouldn't it be better for you to have training in the morning? And in my opinion, you're one of the best people's person I've ever met. The blonde professor nodded kindly at her, taking the compliment warmly. Thanks. Summer started again. That may have been the first time he had spoken casually since she'd met him. He seemed to have noticed this as well as he paused for a second. Well, I could having the combat training in the morning, but then the ones that aren't morning people would definitely not be happy campers. I wouldn't want to impose my preferences on the students that are learning from me. That's just how it is. Summer smiled. You're really mature, Professor. He grinned. It's hard not to be when you have a semblance like mine. By the way, it's a weekend and, technically, you're older than I am. Feel free to call me Naruto. Their menus came, pushing to conversation in a new direction when Summer saw the prices on the dishes. Before she could bolt of the door with the professor in hand, however, he assuaged her fears and discomfort once again. We've already sat down, and I'm actually really impressed by how the waiters are smoothly able to come to our table. I'd like to stay and try their coffee and maybe a couple of their dishes, and I'd like it if you were my company for the breakfast. She hesitantly sat down in her seat again, not sure when she had stood up. I'd love to hang out with you, Professor Naruto. She corrected herself when the blonde's smile rose a bit too high, roughly stretching across his cheeks. That's great. I enjoy spending time with you, and I already view you as a friend. You do. Summer was gripping her pants underneath the cover of the table. She stared into the vast blue oceans. And it stared back with a wondrous depth. Of course. He placed an elbow against table, resting his cheek against his knuckles. You saw something earlier and wanted to bring it up but didn't. When Professor Naruto said that he was older than she, Summer did admit that it was technically a true statement. However, the ease in which he carried himself and could direct conversations, but also recognize specific social cues and deal with them spoke volumes to how astute he was, unnerved her greatly. It was why she was comfortable treating him as a professor and not so much as one the same age as her. Generally, the connotation of a professor, or at least the idea of one, directed one to think of a huntsman that had seen the field and were at least a decade older than the one sitting across from her. Strangely enough, most professors at Beacon said openly that Professor Naruto was not only more talented than every single one of them, he was also currently stronger than any one of them in one-on-one combat. Placing him on a label that said, Professor, and far and away from the label of friend, was reasonable, but it never really made her deny her desire to have him as a friend. After all, he was technically younger than she was. I saw a few people on our way to the city square that were not happy to see you. Why is that? She asked honestly. Naruto lifted his head, minutely to lift his pointer finger so that it pointed at his cheeks. Because of these whiskers. She had never seen them before, but now they stood out to her clear as day. What human has whiskers? None. What faunus have whiskers? Plenty. Suddenly, it all made sense to her. Again, Summer gripped her fists, but it wasn't in silent hope and happiness, and even embarrassment. It was in anger. He silently steamed as a waiter stepped in during the silence and Naruto pointed at 5 different dishes, the waiter nodding at each direction amicably. When the smiling waiter left, Naruto returned his attention to her. An easy smile on his lips. How do you bear it? It's unfair. How does any faunus bear it is the question you should be asking, Summer. It's not like it's any different from the lesson I've taught in class. People are divisive because there are categories. I don't understand. Well, do you really want a lecture here? Summer nodded strongly. Naruto let out a breath, almost in tired amusement, and decided to humor the talented blooming huntsman. As you already know, there are 4 main locations of civilization. In each different city, you'd find that there is a D.F.F. errant physical structure to acclimate to the climate. Understandably, this climate can result in a different economic climate. For example, Atlas is well known for their technology, Mistral for their oneness with nature, Vacuo with aridity and comfort in heat, and As in Vale. One in Mistral would be hard-pressed to survive in Vacuo, not only because they are not acclimated mentally, but because their bodies are not physically adapted to the climate. They were not born there, and neither were their forefathers. Generations over generations ensure that the best surviving traits would be present in the children. Summer nodded. Theoretically, it all made sense. Naruto seemed to be waiting for her to chime in when a silence took over. Is it like a survival of the fittest? Only those that are refit to live on will pass on their traits to the children, whereas the weak die. Naruto nodded, and she inwardly smiled. You should ask your team how they feel about that topic when you have the chance, the blonde said. He took a few gulps from his cup of tea and continued. Now here's the issue. You have a category now because there are very obvious differences between the 4 kingdoms and its population. To make it even more complicated, you add the faunus. ... Naruto placed both elbows on the white tablecloth and pressed his fingers against each other so that his chin would rest at the top of both sets of knuckles. His eyes suddenly seemed to bore into her, staring into her soul. Are they a citizen of Vale? Well, they have the traits of one, but also the traits of something else entire. Are they Vacuon? They can survive in the desert, and they've been there for generations as well, but perhaps not alongside of humanity. Interesting, isn't it? The faunus, according to history, were never far from man. But never close either. And yet, even the ones that have drawn near and lived alongside the 4 kingdoms find themselves ostracized by the majority of humanity. Summer frowned. True, it made sense. But at the same time, it really didn't. So what are they? Naruto grinned. See, if you mean the faunus, what they are really doesn't matter. As long as there is an us and a them, there will always be issues. It's as simple as there being a disagreement between you and me. No one is going to agree with everything I say, and that holds for every single person in the world. So, I'm not so rosy-eyed and optimistic to say that everyone can live in harmony. However, I am quite sure that as a whole, we can get pretty damn close. ... How are you so sure, WH? And you're also so confident in the divisiveness of humanity? Instead of answering promptly, Naruto took a few seconds to look straight into her eyes. It was only a few seconds, but it felt longer. She was laid bare, stripped of all pretenses before it. This was not a friend. Not her professor. It was something far more knowledgeable, but also frighteningly primal. And then it was gone. The clarity in his eyes had returned. And it was once again her professor, the very same one she wished to be friends with and draw a close connection to. The vital festival. It brings everyone together. A. Lee. GHT as bright as the dawn shone in Summer's eyes. Ah, you've heard of it. Who hasn't? The young pupil almost acted affronted by the question. It's not as if she had been looking forward to it in the event her whole life up to this point. There hasn't been a time that I haven't wanted to be on that big stage with everyone in the world watching. All 4 countries sending in their representatives. And each team doing their best to win the festival to proudly raise the cup. Yes, well. Naruto paused, giving a sideways glance over to the waiter that had been dutifully refilling his cups and had gotten their order. In a moment, the table was full of flavors. Summer could hardly believe her eyes, nor her nose as her senses went on overload. For a second, it was all-consuming as every other care in life was pushed aside as the priority of food took over. Perhaps we can talk about this over some delicious food and coffee. She agreed by taking a huge bite out of pancake, already lathered it at no moderate amounts of syrup. She let out a sound of bliss through her throat, eyes closed as she let the flavor sink in. It's so good, she relished. Ha ha ha, I'm glad you like it. Summer continued to stuff her mouth, not even realizing that she spoke with her mouth full. All decorum and manners flew out the proverbial window when the plates were placed on the table. By the gods, it was heavenly. The waffles easily dissolved in her mouth, disappearing into delicious pieces of syrup and carbohydrates. Suddenly, she realized what she had done, and it was not ladylike at all. She whipped her head up, only to catch the sight of Naruto wolfing down as if he were a voracious dragon, humming in delight and eating happily. She knew he didn't eat like that. He was well-mannered, read and generally in control of his desires and manners. However, the fact he acted in such a way, knowing that it would appease her fears due to her earlier actions, did much to calm her. So she continued to eat as such, scarfing down the food at unexplainable rates as Naruto followed pace. For a fraction of a second, she felt truly like they were the same age. Whoa! Summer stumbled. The girl easily caught purchase with the floor and regained her balance. Contentedly, she closed her eyes and sighed, patting her tummy with the air of someone that was at one with heavenly food in large portions. That really was something else. Quote, Naruto stepped out of the bulkhead, his earlier disposition of immaturity and uncleanliness all but gone. He had paid for the meal, and the two had walked around for a bit in the city. During that time, Summer had been content to simply talk with the blonde, and he had been more than willing to oblige to her wishes, conversing with her much like another student. As if they were equals. In fact, she had never felt that they weren't equal other than the fact that officially, one was a student and the other was a professor. However, he always seemed to do his best to make his students feel at home and comfortable whenever in his presence. Unless they said something completely unacceptable, which happened rarely. It was odd that he found racism of any kind so abhorrent and reprehensible. And yet said nothing of the looks he received from the rare passerby in the city. At least, Summer had thought it strange, but Naruto made no noticeable sign of recognition. Despite the fact he was clearly aware of it. How could he not be? He was so aware of most things, it would be more surprising that he wouldn't be. Thanks for the breakfast, Naruto, she decided. Unsure of how to breach the topic again, considering that she couldn't follow through after breakfast. It had been a light atmosphere, especially after he had shown a more childish side, and she didn't want to give that up quite yet. It was a side of him she had never seen, and she wanted to hold on to it as long as she could. It had been why she had tried to get him to keep talking to him walking around the city for a few hours. Of course he complied, and he talked to her like a friend would, telling her how he was never comfortable with a gun, despite its unique status as normal in the civilized world. He answered all her questions about the four kingdoms and the politics that surrounded each great city. He even laughed when she asked how long it would take to catch up to his level. An honest question, one that he answered by flicking her forehead and with the odd response of when she was capable of projecting her aura. In the present, the blonde gave her an easy smile that positively glowed in the noon lighting. There's no such thing as a free meal. He then turned purposely to face the newly painted structures of Beacon Academy as he stepped off the bullhead and onto campus. At first, his words seemed to be a reminder that she had done him a favor, so he was simply returning it with his own. At all, a gift is expected to have some form of reciprocation. However, it could also be construed as if something is given, expect nothing as a freebie in general. Otherwise, there was probably some other underhanded deal happening at the table. It appeared that her professor was starting to lean towards the latter. The rather miffed Glinda Goodwitch standing at the gates of Beacon was a standout indicator. Her arms were crossed beneath her budding breasts, and her sharp gaze was set on Naruto, who had that same easy grin on his lips. You did it again. Naruto easily slipped away from the accusation. Actually, I took no part in painting. Summer did it all. Glinda swept her gaze from the Cheshire grinning blonde to Summer. Immediately, Summer caught onto what was happening. Her face deepened heavily in a blush. Oh, how she wished she could disappear into her scarf and hole up in her room. Away from Glinda's orbs melting her in her very spot. You tricked her. That wasn't what she was expecting. Looking up from the breathtaking floor, Summer caught Glinda pointing a finger dangerously close to Naruto's nose. Don't even try to get uppity with me. You'll get no points for that. Naruto, to his credit for maintaining composure, casually laughed and shrugged his shoulders. Of course. Well, I had fun today. He craned his neck so that he was able to look at her. Thanks to you. It was nice to play a prank on the prestigious school. And then he just walked away. Glinda and Summer watched him walk away until he was gone over a hill, on his way to the very pink beacon. In silence, Glinda stepped over, closer to Summer. There's no such thing as a free meal, Glinda suddenly said. Summer perked her ears up. That's what he told me. Glinda nodded in understanding, eyes on the bullheads and the city far in the edge of view. He tells that to only those that he plays a prank on. Summer's eyes widened. At first, shock overtook her, but it quickly shifted gears to surprised laughter, and then full-on raucous humor as the oddity of the situation took over. The prestigious school, Beacon Academy, was completed covered in a new color. And it was done at the whim of one professor simply because he willed it on an unknowing student. And then, the diligent, hard-working, and top of her class Glinda Goodwitch was tricked into a prank. How could that even occur? You're probably wondering how I got caught. Don't make that face, it's easy to read. Here's the thing, Naruto plays a prank at least once a month, but this is the largest one he's done yet. Probably has something to do with the fact that you're a first year and don't know about this as a tradition for the past 10 months. Also, he gets us by using our own personalities and characteristics against us. Remember, I appreciated Naruto as a teacher and as a person, but not so much as a friend. I was willing to learn from him, but not be close to him. He used that against me. As for you, Summer, you wish to be closer to him. More than a professor and a student, but are unsure of how to break that barrier because of how large of a gap in maturity and skill there is. Summer deflated, but Glinda continued uncompromisingly. At least, that's my guess from what I've been able to scrutinize from your interactions. Anyway, for the gap in maturity, you really don't have to worry. This was his way of saying that. Summer remained silent, unsure of how to break it down in a way for it all to make sense to her. After a good half-minute, she sat down at the edge of the port and let her legs dangle in the air, hundreds of feet above Purchase. Perhaps the gap between her and the G-round was the difference in skill between her and the professor. So this is all normal. She only heard Glinda's sigh and clothes ruffle, indicating a shrug. Not really, as it never happened until Naruto's induction into Beacon. But every single person he's pranked had needed something, and he had provided it in a way through his pranks. I was a stiff person, believe it or not. Summer mock class. Pet her hands to her mouth and took a sharp breath of fake disbelief. I had no clue. She received a slap on the back for her sarcasm as Glinda sat herself down at the edge right next to her. Don't get sarcastic with me, Missy. I still have to clean up your mess, even if it was due to Professor Naruto's sly methods. The beautiful blonde fourth year pinched the bridge of her nose, but in good humor. I can't believe he did this. Though, we just recently discovered that I was able to control my telekinesis with far more finesse and control than expected, but I'm unsure if I'm capable of this kind of job. Think of it as training. Summer supplied meekly. That's exactly what he said, before he pulled this prank and warned me of something potentially happening today. Ah, yup, Glinda said, popping the last syllable deliberately. But it's all right. I was expecting something, just not to his magnitude. I suppose he really wants to test my limits. Summer looked off in the distance, to the blue sky full of bullheads dotting the view. So he did this to help me. I guess I feel a bit closer to him. He is more like a child than I expected, but he's still mature beyond me, at least. Trust me, he has his immature moments. Glinda stood up and patted down her thighs. I'm going to get started on the campus, hopefully I'll be done before dinner. That way, I'll be able to grill Naruto over the table. Summer raised her eyebrows. Didn't you say that you were going to get him in trouble? Glinda shook her head. If it was the me a year ago, I absolutely would have. But remember what I said. I'm not as stiff now. Also, he helped me. So I have to be willing to help him out sometimes, you know. There's no such thing as a free meal, the first year whispered thoughtfully. Glinda gave a ghost of a smile before walking away. Make sure to not to tell anyone that phrase before they get pranked. It's tradition. After Summer replied with an immediate approval, Glinda also said, and expect detention for the next month. Summer was going to make sure the next 2 meals were worth her lost free time in the weekends. Hey, Summer, we were wondering where you went since you weren't here in this morning. Ended up getting breakfast without you. Since you were out, you probably saw the campus, huh? Crazy, whoever did it. Summer nodded idly at Taiyang's greeting, smiling normally but hardly present. Ah, yeah, that was me. Everyone in the room stopped what they were doing and immediately stilled. Except Summer. She kept moving about the room, making her bed, fixin' G up her section of the room and doing whatever she wanted. In the end, Kiro was the one to break the silence. You were the one that painted the entire campus? He incredulously asked. His eyes met Raven's curious orbs. I wouldn't expect you to be such a prankster. Summer laid herself in bed on top of the blankets. It wasn't even really me, I just provided the labor. Naruto was the one that tricked me into doing it. And in the end, I'm probably going to lose my rights to the weekends for the next month. That's convenient timing. All eyes shifted to Raven's thoughtful form. She was now sitting up in bed. Her legs crossed over the other as her left hand acted as a support for her right elbow. Her index knuckle softly pressed against the bottom of her lips as she hummed. The vital FEs. Tivol is also a little over a month away, and detention could take any form in Beacon. Taiyang pulled over a chair and sat in it so that the back support was in front, his legs splayed out to the side. You're saying the professor set her up so that he can train her individually? Raven met his gaze and nodded. I think it's certainly a possibility. But at the same time, that leaves the question of why the three of us are also not in detention. I don't deny that we are the most likely options for the first years to be proposed for the Vital Festival, but the four of us have things to work on altogether and individually. It doesn't make sense to only invite the team leader, who has the highest grade in the combat class for the month, unless there's something that Professor Naruto sees in that can only be improved upon in a singular environment. Yeah, it is strange, isn't it? Kiro murmured. Raven's gaze narrowed and her visage displayed pressure on the other three inhabitants of the dorm room. What's stranger is how our dear team leader called the professor by his name only without any formality and how casually she did so. Summer's half-aware state was broken. A blush worked its way to her cheeks, red as roses. It was an accident. She crossed her arms in an X in front of her chest. Likely. Raven spoke clearly, showing her lack belief in Summer's truthfulness. She stood up and walked to the door. I'm going to find our dear professor and see if he's free for some training and a few questions. If you need me, feel free to message. Raven made for the handle, B. Summer called out before she could open the door. Raven. Well, I guess this can go to everyone. Do any of you think that Naruto is a faunus? What gave you that idea? Kiro asked. He looks as non-faunus as every other non-faunus. Taiyang nodded. Unless you have some hard evidence, I don't see how you can label him as a faunus. Besides, what does it change if he is? Nothing would change, Summer agreed. But I was curious. Because he has those whiskers on his cheeks, and I think a few people assume he's a faunus and think lesser of him as a result. Which students? Raven glowered. The other girl by the door seemed prepared to pull out her blade and threaten some unlucky souls. No, they aren't students. They're just regular citizens of Vale. Summer cried out. No need for that. Kiro leaned back in bed, his head sinking into a pillow. That's odd that citizens from the city would give you that vibe. I always thought that our professor was the most well-known and regarded individual besides our very own headmaster. Summer crossed her arms and huffed. That's what I thought. But then we were walking around the city this morning, and he got more than his fair share of looks that gave off a worse than neutral impression. It was just bizarre until I recalled his whiskers and how it could be seen as a trait of a faunus. She let out another breath out of frustration. Why can't they see him as the person he is? Raven opened the door, interrupting Summer's flow as she clearly indicated that she wished to leave. However, before she stepped away from the room, she fixed her gaze on her team leader with a lone, red eye. It's quite clear that you consider him in high regards, especially after your outing with him this morning. Isn't that all that matters? Whether or not he's a faunus. You undoubtedly have faith in our professor. The others do not matter, because they are insignificant others. Her piece said. Raven shut the door on her way out. Summer, Taiyang, and Kiro sat slightly stupefied by the brusque method in which Raven spoke her thoughts. Well, Taiyang and Summer were rather miffed, but Kiro took it in stride, as he was used to it as her brother. So, Does it not matter whether or not he's a faunus? Kiro took it upon himself to clearly explain his sister's position. Sitting up on his bed, he fluffed his pillow so that his back was comfortably resting against it and placed a fist against his chin. Let's be honest here. None of us would care if he turned out to be a faunus, because the truth of the matter is, he's a professor Beacon due to his accomplishments and his skill set. Also, he actually teaches well and all of the students have generally spoken in an overwhelmingly positive way about him, despite his rather Spartan regimen. So we, as students and as people that actually know the professor, place no value on the status of faunus on the professor. And isn't that exactly what he wanted us to learn in the first week of class? That faunus and non-faunus are all essentially the same in the end, living beings. Despite the difference in characteristics, we still exist together in remnant. Taiyang nodded eagerly. Exactly. Without him and the rest of the professors at Beacon, it would have been far more difficult for us to become huntsmen. Kiro let that fly right over his head and thought about his next words. My sister has a rather divisive outlook on the world. It's not quite as bad as it sounds, but she believed that the weak die and the strong survive. Again, it's a lot worse than it sounds, I promise you. He told Summer placatingly when the girl clearly began to show displeasure. It's just how the two of us were raised, so don't take it the wrong way. I'm only trying to explain her perspective. We, he indicated by circling a finger in the air to gesture, are the strong. All of the students that made it to Beacon probably fits into her definition of the strong. The rest of citizens that have no combat skill or dabble in it lightly, so they rely on the huntsman to keep them safe. They fit into the category of the weak, the insignificant. But that's wrong. Kiro raised a hand to her exclamation. Let me finish. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of whose worldview and mindset is right or wrong. I simply want to tell you what my sister is thinking. She doesn't care what the weak think. Because they aren't a factor. They don't affect her life. They aren't even so much as a part of it, so why should she care? Her entire life, gaining strength and proving that she was strong was her goal. Therefore, opinions on whether the professor is a faunus or not means little to her. And even if he was, why should she care? She approves of his teaching and she has said so, if not directly, then by her actions and body language. As for the citizens, their opinions on the matter mean nothing, because they aren't focused on the aspect of strength, but a superficial characteristic that has no sway in any real way. That makes sense, I suppose. Summer pressed her thumbs together, her hands on her lap. But you make it sound like she doesn't care about the citizens of Vale. That's because she doesn't. Oh, how close he was to saying that. Luckily, or unluckily, depending on what ending was wished to be seen, Taiyang intervened. Nah, she can't be like that. There was a noticeable silence that established itself in the room. Kiro refluffed his pillows and sat back against the wall, thinking about past memories. That night when he had made a promise to his sister. His prodigious sister. One that he had always relied on. Perhaps it was because he had one person he could always rely on that he ended up partially understanding of people that relied on the strong. But how could one that was always considered the pinnacle of strength from her family consider anything other than a strict, distinct line in between the strong and the weak? To her, perhaps he qualified to be strong. He was capable enough to carry himself on the field, and the fine line between the two was no longer a veritably impossible to cross ocean, but more like a wide, raging river. Kiro turned his head out to the window, where the sun was high in its position. Its orangish glow softly basked against the reflective clouds that were colored like a painter's canvas. My sister isn't like that. There's nuance to her you don't realize yet. Professor. Naruto sat with his legs at the edge of a cliff near the border of Beacon's academy. His hair slowly swung to and fro. The locks of gold glinting brightly. His back to her, he was set in a sketch. You always seem to show up whenever I'm in thought. He hadn't turned to her yet, his eyes on the horizon. On the city of Vale. I wonder if it has to do with your semblance. Raven's feet crunched on the grass that was slowly shifting from the bright green to a slightly dark hue of brown as fall came around in full force. Before she knew it, winter would fall on them and warmer wear would be the norm. I was under the impression that professors would know each student's semblance, especially one in a combat class. Her prod was returned with a chuckle that was as soft as the sun's glow. As warm as a fire or a hearth in a terrifying chilly day. You're right. As a professor, I should be keenly aware of each student that I supervise. In my defense, I do have a gist of each student's semblance due to my own semblance. I can positively state that I actually know most of the first year's semblance better than they do. Is that also because of your semblance? She asked. For some reason, she wasn't surprised by these proclamations any longer. Absurdity was the new normal with this specific professor, and it was welcome. It would be strange to be with normal huntsmen after 4 years. However, that was a thought for 4 years later. Not for now. It is. Is your semblance like mine? She asked, her tone serious. His eyes finally broke away from the view and captured hers. She was still looking to the city to see what he saw in it. Why he looked at it like it was so beautiful, she couldn't understand. But she wished she could. She wanted to understand. Unconsciously, she really wanted to understand his mindset to try to grasp how he became powerful. She looked him in the eyes. Ruby red on ocean blue. Blood. The life of humanity. Water, the instrument that sustained life and humanity. If you consider it broadly, yes. Connecting with others, she clarified. He only smiled. I know that isn't what you have. Raven clicked her tongue, but otherwise remained mute. But I'll humor you anyway. In a way, connecting with others is my ability. One would even say that it's my strongest ability. You have more than one ability. That had almost gotten a rise out of her. However, again, abnormal was the new normal when it came to Professor Naruto. He shook his head and lifted a single finger. One semblance. But multiple abilities tied to that semblance. Smart girl. I'm older than you are. Still abiding by my stance. Isn't Vale beautiful? It's not like my home. If I wanted to be near home at heart, I'd go to Mistral. Maybe Menagerie, that small city is growing into a beautiful one. Granted, every single one of the 4 kingdoms have absolutely incredible views. But none of them have the same heart that Vale has. I wonder why that is. Have you been to the kingdoms? Short visits. But at Vale I stayed. You could feel it. The warmth. She couldn't. There is a connection between each person here that isn't seen in the other kingdoms. Maybe Menagerie, but their connections are thinly veiled with hatred and sputtering, boiling rage. For a second, the air stilled. Almost like magic. Heaviness pressed down, and even the calm grass seemed to cower and flatten near the blonde. Raven instinctively clasped onto his shoulder, grasping it as if it were a lifeline. Suddenly, as quickly as it had appeared, the pressure had gone. Like one of those random rain showers that came and went within minutes. Naruto took a long breath, the air seeping in through his lips like a hollow straw. Slowly did the life come back to the plants as the physical weight on the plants lifted and the horrifying gaze Naruto had on whatever it is. In the far beyond dissipated into a tired stare. It wasn't something that a 15-year-old should have. She had seen those eyes, downtrodden and exhausted with life, on only one soul. He was old, a rarity in her tribe, but respected due to his age. However, as he grew, so did his skepticism and his jadedness. In the end, he died, bitter and alone. He had let no one into his life, and no one dared to enter. She bent down to one knee, still holding onto his shoulder. She cared not for the general feelings she held when it came to showing emotions and helping others. Naruto would not be the same as that dastardly old man. He wouldn't become like him. I'm sorry. She didn't know what to say. Whatever she wanted to say lodged itself into her throat. In the end, there was a silence between the two as she gripped his shoulders a bit tighter, and Naruto looked over to the end of the world's view with a solemn air. But, she had to admit, at this moment, in Naruto's singular moment of vulnerability, she felt that she could help him. For the first time, she could return something for all of the lessons and extra time he had given to her. If anything, she returned goodwill. What do you need? She asked. Slowly. Naruto shook his head. His eyes were squeezed shut and his hands gripped tightly in balls of fists. Through closed eyes and tight lips, he spoke. It's not about what I need. It's about what others need. Raven flinched. She had shown him her willingness to help, and he wasn't willing to take it. Fine. She let go of his shoulder and stood up abruptly. What do you think of Menagerie? He asked before she could leave. She turned back to face him, his oddly small back facing her as he looked on at the world before him. You probably have met plenty of faunus and traveled plenty, considering your background. Raven's heart beat harshly against her chest at that. Don't be surprised. I've been around the world, and I can recognize your fighting style. And your brothers as well. Derivatives. But created due to necessity for the purpose of survival. And on the first day, you were the only one that was willing to fight me with enough force to send an amateur or us. To the hospital for weeks without hardly a second thought. A few tense eye blinks, and Raven walked forward so that she stood next to her professor again. I don't know about menagerie other than history books and what the majority say. My travels hardly affected my perspective on them, because my livelihood did not matter when it came to viewing humans or faunus differently. Naruto sighed at her response. The majority. As in what the media tells you. Menagerie, the home of the faunus. Their safe haven. Their isolated home that they built from the ground up due to humanity's disease. On to shoehorn the faunus population into there. Not all, but a good number. Even if the Great War resulted in menagerie, which was meant to give them a home to address the misgivings that were shown to the faunus before. It instead resulted in a different response. Faunus are only truly home when they are amongst themselves, safe and happy in no kingdom because of general public perception. The majority. They should fight for their rights, she said. To prove the majority wrong. I'm sorry, Raven. My point isn't what they should do or can do, but rather the oddity that an entire race can only be happy in isolation. Safe and separated. Raven hesitated, her red eyes wavering as she thought about his words. Not once did she consider it odd that faunus were generally sparse in numbers and they populated menagerie. That was simply history and current facts, so she took it as such. Never did she question whether or not it was really something right. That was a lie. She knew it was a lie. She trusted the faunus in her class. She believed in them to be strong people that strived for improvement, and they were no different than she. They breathed the same aspirations. But she never applied that same concept to menagerie. She wouldn't have difficulty treating faunus neutrally due to her professor, and would only make her opinions on each individual after they had shown their worth. But Naruto. His eyes creased and eyes focused on the drop below. Can you imagine how painful it must be to not even be considered human? To be looked upon as something less than equal when you share the same life. The same mental faculties. And yet, you are seen as a monster. Naruto spat out the last word as if it held venom. Anguish, exhaustion, triumph, tiredness, defeat, victory. All in one word. It didn't make sense to her. Why would he respond in such a way to the idea of menagerie? If he was such a strong advocate of equal representation and rights for faunus, he was definitely capable of making a difference. He was strong enough. But it's not just you. Her thoughts died as his voice returned, calmer and neutral. The eye in a storm. His hair shifted slowly, menacingly as the sun seemed to change shades to red and white, like the hottest section of a blacksmith's forge. It's you and your entire race, scorned by the other side. It's you against them. Violence won't solve the answer unless you completely stomp the other side. Protesting is too slow because media will never shift to your side. What do you do? I would fight. Oddly, Naruto turned to Raven and gave her a smile. Kindred link was an oddity when it came to semblances. A strong emotional link allowed her the ability to create portals in between her and the target of her connection. Truthfully, she had not created such a link with Naruto. But there were remnants, echoes of an attachment that could be in the future. She felt that smile was like one given to say, "You remind me of myself when I was younger." But why would that smile mean something like that? The world needs more minds like you. To forget the complexity of it all and to tackle it in a straightforward manner. When stuck between a rock and a hard place, you strike back because perhaps there is no other response. Naruto's smile faltered as he turned away from Raven and pointed out to the reach. To the far away. To somewhere out in Remnant. But there is another response. Out there, there is the great enemy of humanity. The one that can't distinguish between faunus and humans because to them, we are one and the same. We are hunted because we are living beings. Grim. I don't see how that is supposed to be how we unify our people, Professor. Naruto genuinely hesitated as he seemed to be deciding whether to tell her something or to hold back. There's more than Grimm out there in the world, Raven. Remember when I said people are the most dangerous threats to humanity? Grimm are dangerous in the sense that they are a force. Run in packs and overrun our best huntsmen through sheer numbers, overpowering us with their stature and strength due to mass and unequal physical abilities. But mankind's ingenuity always evens the playing field. His eyes again tore away from the horizon, as if he was physically drawn to it. As if he knew that there really was something out there, threatening the entirety of mankind. The issue was, Raven didn't doubt him. And her mind was working overtime as she took the hints he was giving him, knowing that he gave her the information she needed, but not on a silver platter. She always saw his eyes as warm and inviting. Then maybe that was why she found it like an anchor on her own heart when his eyes brimmed with tears. No, Raven, an enemy out there is going to be the unifying factor of Remnant. One day, all of mankind will be forced to respond or all will fall. Raven laid in bed with her eyes open, staring at the ceiling and nothing at the same time. Summer had tried to talk to her earlier. But Raven had been rather dismissive. It hadn't been her intention to make her team leader feel even worse. However, she had strong doubts that she would have M8 for a conducive conversation partner in her current state of mind. In the end, the other three in the team had dinner together, while Raven had went on her own at the end of the serving period, closer to around 9 p.m. She could have gone later, but training, stretching, cooling down, and her nightly routine would have taken her closer to midnight that she would have liked if she wanted to keep grinding her training to keep her mind off her thoughts. If she were honest with herself, her mind wasn't still, even during her practice. Her conversation kept running on replay, like a faulty tape. That could only play one specific scene. The rest of the tape may be faded and bruised, but this specific section was beautifully contained and maintained. There's an enemy out there. Worse than the Grimm, but he clearly pointed out the Grimm. Why would he say there's a person after pointing out the Grimm? Someone was out there, threatening the entire livelihood of mankind. Alongside the threat of the Grimm. She blinked. Grimm, and people. No. Grimm, and someone. An enemy. The thought of someone able to work together with Grimm passed her mind idly. Ludicrous. But Naruto hardly feared Grimm. But he feared people. What chaos they can bring about. The thought of what havoc a person that could control and work with Grimm began to domino, and the cards started to come into place. Her mind began to shift into overdrive, and the night felt young. But still, there was a key detail missing. Why didn't he say that he would fight? Flashes of his tired smile kept coming into mind. That night, Raven had dreams of a world's end, and Remnant overrun by Grimm and a shadow looming over the burning kingdom of Vale. A shadowed face watched with impassive care, levitating high in the air with impossible ease. A sly smile, satisfied with the destruction it had wrought, was seen under the hood. And Naruto was nowhere to be seen as the world knew darkness. Every morning, there was a stillness that shrouded itself over Beacon, much like how one would describe the night sky with a blanket of stars. The silence and immobility of the campus took over everything for the few minutes of its existence, letting nothing out of its white-knuckled grasp. But even its grip on stillness was calm, and it would eventually loosen. The first person would awake, and then another. Each person would prepare for the day, and the first signs of life would show itself like grass sprouting through the earth in the early spring. It was hardly an indication, almost imperceptible, as it were indoors. However, much like a well-functioning oiled machine, once motion and life began, none could stop its path towards overtaking stillness in the morning. Naruto awoke in the stillness. When dawn was in the future. But night was past and the day was hue of violet and dark blues. Every morning, he would rise before the dawn, where he would wade in pools of darkness before light would fully wander onto the land. It made no difference if the shades next to his bed were open or shut. Darkness came all the same, and by the time he was fully arisen and light had carefully sprung its step on the grass and earth, Naruto was standing in the open. He pulled the sheets off him. It was warm and heavy, a kindness considering that winter was coming soon. The people called it a comforter. And the one on top a thunder blanket. The latter was apparently meant for pets and the like, as it soothed their instincts. Mankind relied on instincts, and he felt no need to ever ignore his, so he bought one for himself. Made and tailored for humans, mind you. It had done him wonders for his sleep. Anything would, really, if compared to his prior conditions of sleeping on uneven earth in the forest. The forests had been a home to him. Perhaps it was not as convenient as the civilization that he lived in now, but there was a convenience that could be found only when one lived in nature's grasp. It came in the form of independence. Not in the way that one declared independence from their parents, no, he would have hung on to his if they lived, but in the way everything a person needed was within reach. Nothing was ever more than a few miles range. Mutely, Naruto shook his head. There was a full day ahead of him. Standing from his bed, he walked over to the closet directly across the side of his bed. Picking out a loose white shirt with soft red accents to match with the slightly more formal and presentable red slacks with pre-made cuffs. 10 paces to the right, he entered his personal bathroom and flicked on the lights. His eyes adjusted so that he was able to see himself through the mirror. With practice and efficacy, Naruto put his folded clothes on the polished marble counter before turning on the shower. Steam soon rose from the floor, swirling and dancing through the drops of water. Naruto stepped in, and the tension bled from his body. Stress bled from his mind. All there was in that moment was him in a hot rain. And yet, it was the dreams that brought him back to reality. He had another one of those dreams. Those dreams. Not at all like the others. And he had become quite good at remembering them and being able to differentiate. He couldn't remember when they had started, but every dream he vividly felt alive occurred once he began the practice of meditating. By the time he was dressed and outside, first light had struck the earth. The dew from the rapidly warming earth were light-bursting crystals full of brilliance and color. Fog escaped his lips as he crossed from his building to the kitchen. Unsurprisingly, he didn't cross a single soul on his short walk, the echo of his shoes the only companion. "You're late," Glinda said. She was wearing a white collared top with a black skirt, finished with a formal flare. Her eyes were on the watch clasped against her left wrist. Naruto took a seat at the table she had occupied and sheepishly chuckled. "By 23 seconds. Was it not your words that complacency was the enemy of our own survival in this world?" He had said those words to her. In truth, he had told that to the entire class when the year had ended. Knowing that it would be the final official lesson he would have with that batch of students. The third years would be taken on by the next instructor for more advanced topics and team training. Although Naruto was deemed the best combat instructor in terms of pure individual combat, and this was only recently determined and acceptable conjecture to provide, he had yet to prove his mettle in improving team environments and the ease in which teams functioned. In his conversation with Ozpin in his interview, he had told Ozpin he strongly believed that the teams he created were rather informal and were created out of pure luck, but he also didn't mind that concept. After all, teams must be able to function no matter who they work with. Hunters and huntresses oftentimes wouldn't have the choice of who they work with, and are thus forced to work with individuals they may despise. However, emotional baggage and petty squabbles are all removed under the circumstance of threat to one's life. Very fairly, in Naruto's opinion, he said any form of complacency in their field of work would result in an untimely death. Striving for greatness was the only way one could see years beyond parenthood. To lose a parent as a child would be too heartbreaking for him to bear if he would ever be the messenger. True, those were my words. He palmed his chin and yawned. Glinda slid over a file stuffed with papers inside. The graded answers with constructive criticism. Although you should review them yourselves in case. If I made any errors was unsaid. She had confidence in herself. Something that Naruto had been working on for her. She had started with arrogance, but he had broken that root from the core. However, it had left a rift in her belief in herself and knowledge of capability. He had done his best to bridge the gap, and it was slow work. Nearly 9 months and only now was she not questioning herself with every misstep, rather taking the mistakes as a step for growth. "Thank you," he said. He smiled appreciatively when she also put down a cup of coffee on his right, steaming and brewed strongly. She sat opposite of him. "You had one of those dreams again." He took a healthy drink from the coffee. Silence reigned supreme for a few seconds, and finally Naruto nodded. It was the only reason he was ever late in the morning, and eventually he told Glinda that he was having odd dreams. She was never informed of the details of what occurred in the nightly visions, but she was the only person aware that he had dreams that would cause him any pause. He never was late if he could help it. Something about being a teacher and running late always rubbed him the wrong way. They aren't nightmares. She was also the only person he believed that may take him seriously on first notice. Dreams weren't seen as anything superstitious in Remnant. They had no real weight. And yet, she took his word at face value and made sure that he was at full health. No. He stood up and made his way to the kitchen. I'm going to start cooking. Want anything in particular? I'll take some of the ribeye, rice, and a cup of coffee. Raven strode through the door, announcing her presence as her short heels clacked against the stone. Please, she finished, when she made eye contact with Naruto, who had looked over his shoulder. Red and black were her colors of the day. A red jacket with a single line of purple that stretched down her right arm, and a black combat skirt over her black tights. Her voluminous hair was up in a ponytail, although it was more appropriate to compare it to an upside-down pineapple. All in all, the look was good. It wouldn't get in the way of training, and he wouldn't have to worry. Comfortable, aesthetic, and practical. Good for you to join us, Raven. Her eyes hardly softened, but there was a reaction. I'll take a pair of eggs and some sausages, please, Glinda said. She then waved over Raven to sit and pull out one of the sheets from the file she had left for Naruto. They had been doing this every Monday, reviewing the prior week's evaluations on her. Glinda simply did it because she preferred teaching the younger girl over reading a book in the morning. It held more value and mentally engaged her. Review was healthy, both for the teacher and the student. It was also especially helpful that Raven soaked in all of the knowledge, completely intent of taking everything from each lesson and applying it for the next week. It was part of the reason why she had seen so much rapid progress in her technical prowess and strategical approaches to combat. So this here, you tried to gain an advantage. Naruto drowned out the noise when he stepped into the kitchen. He could still hear Glinda's Suchi NCT explanations and Raven's hums of acknowledgement. Raven. He looked up from the counter with the gathered ingredients and through the opening that gave a full view to the expansive dining hall. Her red eyes were fully focused on the papers and Glinda's finger pointing at a scroll, no doubt covering a recent spar. Her lips were pressed tightly, an unconscious response for whenever she felt that she had erred. It was a tic that he had recognized almost from the beginning of their acquaintanceship, but he had yet to try to focus on that aspect. She had more pressing matters to focus on, and he would begin on verbal and physical tells starting in third year when he would hopefully be given another class to teach. He really hoped. Even with his stretched schedule, he wished he could do more for his students. If only they wouldn't come out like Sylvia Silvers did last night. She had fallen near the edge of the kingdom, and he had grieved when he was alone. A bustling fourth year with snarky responses and hellish quips. But a good, righteous heart. He would remember her. Naruto remembered every one of his students. He looked down, back to the eggs and beef and condiments spread out before him. Now it was time for him to focus on the creation of the most important meal of the day. Breakfast, a necessary meal that would set the tone until night fell and one slipped under their covers. In a few minutes, the papers were cleared from the table, and the three were eating in a comfortable silence. So what are you going to try to preach to us today? Raven said. Naruto cocked his head, then chuckled. What? Sometimes. You're more of a preacher, gifting us poor plebeians a sermon in the shape of a lesson. I find it rather difficult to defend your case, Naruto. Glinda had also been using his name in private, which he had been grateful for. Today, we will expand on each of your critical thinking capabilities. To be a good hunter and huntress, a keen and adaptable mind makes a well-rounded individual. For example, what is the difference between a scholar and an ignorant soul? Raven sniffed. To be frank, there doesn't seem to be a difference between the two at times. GL. Inda's eyes showed a hint of amusement amid her silence. Snarky responses and witty comments were something of a rarity around Naruto once students had internalized that he deserved respect. Even when he would sometimes lighten the mood and act in high spirits, the best he'd get would be a raucous laugh and amused students. Raven was everything that the other students did not act. She was unruly, yet still refined. She was harsh with her words, but also concerned and forward-looking. And she talked back and was always unafraid to do so. Otherwise, how would she learn? Asking questions and pressing buttons were her ways to learning, so she would unapologetically push through with her methods. Naruto smirked. I'll remember to not take you on any political excursions in the future until you clean up your quips. Not that it wouldn't be allowed, but that you need to be able to do so in a way that is both in good humor and welcoming to whoever is the victim of said remark. He palmed his chin, tapping a finger against his cheek. His eyes glazed in though. I suppose you are correct. There is sometimes little to point out the difference between the two categories. However, the argument could be made equally well that two students who start at the same point in strength with vastly different work ethics are the same. He stared straight at Raven now. The argument simply does not hold up. Is that your lesson for today? I have no doubt that it would go well with your students, Glinda said. Her sarcasm was not ignored. Naruto knew that most students that came to Beacon came to hone their technical skills and physical abilities. However, it was absolutely necessary to have people that could be trusted out in the field. Not only trusted due to strength, but also due to quality of mind and trust in their mental faculties. He stood up, picking up the dishes that were wiped clean. After they were placed away in the kitchen, he began to walk towards the door. The other two caught up to him in moments. It's not really a matter of how well it is received by the others in terms of appreciation. What matters more is how effective it is for their future and whatever endeavors they may have. Rather dangerous argument if you ever have a student that goes astray and becomes a felon. A huntsman-level mob boss with a keen awareness of the political and social world would be rather frightening if they were to ever be discovered to be under your tutelage. Naruto frowned at Glinda's point, but he found little reason to be deterred. Unlikely. Well, I will see you after my classes tonight, Professor. Glinda took a turn once they were outside, the cold wind reminding them that winter was soon to be upon them. Do you actually do anything politically? Raven asked after a few minutes of silence. The two walking together in comfort. They had come to respect each other's presence over the past month. Although she rarely felt the need to actually be with him, it was better than playing board games with her roommates. As a plus, he was constantly in thought, and she was sometimes able to garner a few gems for thought that she would analyze overnight to wonder over their purity and quality. The vital festival is coming up, Naruto finally said. When it seemed that he would say no further, which Raven was fine with, he decided to elaborate. I was assigned by the headmaster to travel to Atlas's delegate. Couldn't you simply give them a call through a scroll or another communication device and be done with it? She asked. Naruto gave her a sideways glance, smiling at her question. Perhaps once, in a different lifetime, he would have thought the same. It's a show of good faith. My presence shows trust on the side of Vale, and they would have to reciprocate that trust on their end. His words gave Raven a tumble. Did he just imply that there was the possibility of strenuous tension between the two kingdoms? Also, it's much to get to know and understand a person when you in the same rooms. Not thousands of miles apart. And finally, it would be my first time traveling outside of the kingdom as a professor for Beacon, so it was bound to happen eventually. It is a rather easy job and it should be fun. But I'm mainly sent to create an impression. An impression, Raven said. She was still fixated on the implication of his other statement. To tell our allies that Beacon is strong and well protected. In terms of pure individual combat, I don't think anyone in his academy can best me. She had never heard him say that out loud. She had assumed it, and he had implied it. But he had never actually said it so straight. And Atlas seems to hold strength in a very high regard. Raven nodded. That's understandable. Strength is a quality anybody can appreciate. Naruto hummed in agreement. His eyes betrayed a stance that differed slightly from hers. It was the same as if someone had told her a butcher and a chef had the same job of preparing meat. Technically, true. Thematically and for all intents and purpose, completely different. They entered the combat facility. The smell of alcohol and freshly cleaned stone walls and floor permeated powerfully. At first, Raven had found the stench repugnant, but she had quickly grown used to it. It was hygienic, and considering how some students lived their lives, she was rather glad for it. She had caught a few students stating that they were exhausted and were simply going to crash on their beds when they got back. Sweaty and disgusting. If they didn't have the discipline to stay awake to shower. They probably didn't have the discipline to wake up in the morning to laundry their sheets to come back to a clean bed, thus only perpetuating the cycle. So the smell of alcohol was rather welcoming. Trust is strange. Naruto said when they were standing on the stage. Raven was already stretching, making sure her limbs were limber and ready to explode into action. It's not something given freely. Yet if you simply portray yourself as a decent character, people offer their trust rather easily. He shrugged his shoulders. I'd rather them trust someone that is actually a good person than someone acting like one. Raven raised an eyebrow. You're saying you're a good person. Rather odd for you to praise yourself. She spread her legs and bent over to reach her right foot, her hair falling like a waterfall, cascading to the floor. Ah! Naruto scrambled. She grinned in the small victory. The idea I got is that I'm rather young compared to the rest of the staff, so I wou. Eldn't be old enough to understand all the politicking. I should be straightforward. Raven went for the other leg. Right, you should be. Sounds like you're saying that you aren't. She certainly hoped so. She looked up to him. The less faults he had, the more opportunities she could take from him to grow. Rather than answer that, how about I ask you a question instead, Naruto said. Raven looked up from the floor. Then slowly stood up. She was still taller than he was, but only marginally now. He'd grown a bit, although his hair made him seem taller. How would you like to come to Atlas with me and Glinda? She wasn't expecting that. Why her? Well, Glinda is pretty much a member of the staff already, and Ozpin actually recommended I take her with me. He also said I could take another person with me if I deemed them qualified. Quote. Perhaps she had said her internal question aloud. Didn't matter. She narrowed her eyes. It sounds like you want to groom me. But again, why me? Why not Summer? Or any of the other third or fourth years who are more qualified for this excursion, as you put it? Naruto sat down. There was no chair, but he procured a plane of aura so that he could comfortably sit and talk at the same time. Because of course he could. The amount of control and output that action took must be astounding. Too much really for her to comprehend at this moment. There were CMPLY too many applications of aura and its abilities that she had yet to really tread into. But without even comprehension of the theory behind the phenomenon taking place before her, Raven had to be thankful for one thing. Naruto was, for all intents and purposes, a good person. The amount of destruction and chaos he could wring out from the kingdoms would be unparalleled if he played for another side. If his ability with aura was as unlimited as his imagination, then any person would be helpless against him. Swords would be rendered useless by any defense he could procure to counter it, and all offense would be shattered as long as he had aura, which he had ungodly amounts of. He was the absolute embodiment of something that exists that shouldn't be. He defied all laws of nature that existed in their current state of the world, and she couldn't help but accept that it was true. How is it possible to deny that there was a person in front of her whose innate connection with his soul and self was so advanced that no one could really assume what his semblance was, simply because his aura was capable of doing things that people could only dream of with their own. Without asking, he redid another makeshift chair for her, nearly 10 feet away from his body. It was perfectly stable and at a good height for her. She looked at him. He seemed to be doing it as easily as he was breathing. She sat into it comfortably. The youngest generation is the king. Raven folded her arms. She glared at him, lips curling. If we're talking about Remnant's defense of royalty, then I disagree. You are king. The king is yourself. And you aim to protect yourself. Naruto nodded, but his eyes betrayed him. He pointed a finger at her. You're the queen, the bishop, the rook, the pawn, perhaps even the unconventional knight. He dropped his hand to his lap. He spoke slowly and surely. But we are not the king. She didn't know the game well, but she knew it well enough. Pawns could be sacrificed. Queens, bishops, rooks, knights. All the same. As long as the king remained alive and some of the other pieces remained to trap the other king, then there would be a victor. And he had said she was a sacrificial unit for the sake of some younger generation. No, I'm not. I refuse to believe that. I make my own calls, and I'm the king. Not some bishop or rook, not the offensive queen or some random knight. I stay alive because I take care for myself. The two stared at each other. Naruto's expression didn't even change. In fact, she almost believed he expected that answer from her, the way he easily stood up and said, "Let's spar." His countenance was nonchalant. He stood slowly, casually removing his chair from existence, and then hers when she stood hurriedly. She was excited, but also feeling itches of irritation. And it upset her. Spotty, hot bursts of heat crackled in her veins as she clenched her fists so tightly in the grip of her sparring sword that the pressure was causing her arms to fatigue faster. She was unusually aggressive. At one point, she had charged at her instructor, jumping into the air in a spin and raising her sword above her whirlwind of hair. And brought the sword down straight to his temple. He saw it coming from a mile away. She was never the aggressor. She always defended. But today, Naruto was the one in her shoes, redirecting and blocking her attacks. Nullifying them or using her movement to his advantage. It was frustrating. Everything was frustrating. Even when she had worn herself down by the time the students had started to trickle in, she was still stewing. Especially when he stood over her, her practice sword in his hand, looking infinitely more at home in his palm than in hers, and he told her to give him an answer by the end of the month. 30 days. Steady. Unending frustration. It appears you gave Ms. Bronwyn a difficult time today. A long pause, and then, mental thrashing of sorts. Naruto looked through the glass and captured the image of the entire city of Vale in his head. From this height, he could see the mountains and the roads that dwindled down to nothing, winding down and down and down. Away. From the mountains and hills that overlooked covered the city in shade as the sun set behind it like an old man walking away from work for the day, the city lay in its bustling self. Unlike some cities, Vale was bright and excited even at night. Lights would dance in the shadows, shining on eager faces that had eyes of heated coals and gems that reflected the colors of a hearth. Groups would wander the city in comfort. Vale was a safe city. Crime was such a rarity that it was top on the news if anything ever did happen. And it hardly ever did. I'm pushing her so that she can reach her limits, Naruto said. Turning so that he faced Ozpin, who was facing him in his reclining chair. They were a top beacon in the headmasters, with an unparalleled view of the world they watched over. The M. And had a white cup of coffee held gingerly between his fingers, the liquid steaming in a fresh fragrance. It appears you have favorites, the headmaster spoke finally, breaking the monotony of ticking clocks. Naruto pressed his crossed arms against his chest. As if you can say otherwise. Raven doesn't come from any city, and neither does her brother. It's a wonder how you even found them. But the other two applied on their own. Naruto leaned against the glass pane. The thin sheet of reinforced glass was the separation between solid footing and hundreds of feet of air. His lips slipped downward. The both of them applied to all 4 main academies in each kingdom. You were the only one to offer a full scholarship and some to them from what I've seen. The papers he had been studying had not only been for class. Besides, you can't say to me that they're normal, either. Ozpin took a sip of his coffee. And why not? A semblance that allows someone to stockpile power the longer AF. It goes as practically unstoppable if someone's base power is high enough. Although Summer has far more talent, Taiyang can practically incapacitate her through her aura with a single hit if he lands it. How is that at all normal? Also, Summer had already accepted her offer from Atlas, but you sent a direct message asking her to reconsider. Good investments require proactive measures. Yeah, that's exactly what I don't like. The question is what exactly you're investing in, and you may have everyone fooled, but you can't hide the truth from me. The blue in his eyes dimmed. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of our influence and where Grimm roam freely, there's an influx of power where all remains of Grimm seem to originate from. I can sense the fake souls of Grimm, and they are all touched by the same entity. Ozpin placed his coffee on the table. His full focus was on Naruto now, gray eyes terribly narrow. Judging by his reaction, Naruto realized that Ozpin really hadn't shared this with anybody. How dangerous. But he had gone this far, so he had no choice but to reveal his hand, and hopefully also reveal how foolish Ozpin had been in assuming that sharing it with nobody was the correct answer. There's something creating Grimm, Naruto said. He pushed away from the pane and made a half circle around the room so that he stood in front of Ozpin's desk. The headmaster followed him, turning in his chair. And nobody seems to know that their existence threatens the balance. Grimm aren't natural. And the issue is that life as a whole is complex, so the being created. These shadows of darkness must also be intelligent enough to know humanity's stance against it. After all, life itself is so complex, it would be a wonder if the one that can create aggressive being. cannot interpret aggression itself against it. The clock ticked on. Ozpin lowered his head and crossed his fingers across the bridge of his nose. The shade from the evening roughly marked the headmaster's features with harsh contrasts. Finally, he breathed in sharply. It's not something, but rather someone. Ozpin turned in his chair so that he was looking towards the sun, back towards Naruto. The cup of coffee was in his hand again. A few people on this campus are aware of its existence, and I've informed others in the other kingdoms. But the number is still in its teens, including you. The gravity pressed against Naruto as if Taiyang had struck him and he hadn't put up an aura shield. Why do so few know? Because in this situation, having the world know would either cause mass panic, or not make a difference. Remember, grim thrill off of fear. By informing the public, we'd only play into their hands. But at least you could inform the council members, never mind. Ozpin nodded. Exactly. If you were headmaster, or really anybody with the information that you knew now, would you give any particulars about this specific case to the corrupt and uncaring council? Personally, I find myself rather aggravated simply by the thought of how they would milk the details for what they were worth, and then somehow find more. He took a slow drink. So no, I have not informed the council. Or any council from any kingdom for that matter. The public would only bring more fear, which would result in a hazardous situation of Grim running into the city without thought of their own peril. And of the people that I can actually trust to not say anything to the wrong people or switch sides, how many actually can make a difference or fight? You're throwing this kind of situation on a 16-year-old. Ozpin spun in his chair again to face Naruto with a smile. I believe you are turning 17 tomorrow. And I did recruit you as well. Naruto almost scowled, but schooled his countenance. I don't thrust these issues upon any 16, soon-to-be 17-year-old staffers. I can assure you of that. The irony of Naruto being the only underaged staffer in the entire premises was not lost on him. Right. Well, I'm not entirely appreciative of this early birthday gift. Care to try again, old man? A healthy raise if you can keep training individual students such as those in STRQ. And perhaps those fourth years you so profoundly adore. Naruto did scowl this time. You want to keep them in Beacon after they graduate. They are all good investments. Naruto rose from his seat. He disagreed with the way Ozpin seemed to view him and the students he were training. They both wanted the absolute best from them, but it seemed the origin for their willingness to seek the fruition of success from their pupils were for different causes. Naruto sought after each of his students to be the best that they can be so that they would survive in the field and hopefully train others to be successful in their hopes and dreams. Ozpin, however, took on a far more utilitarian view. It irked Naruto, but at least their wish for their students to be powerful and self-reliant hunters and huntresses remained. I'm doing it for myself, not for whatever sick game you're playing, Ozpin. I'll take a raise of 15,000 lean. You'd almost be making the amount some of my tenured professors make. Naruto raised an eyebrow. Good. Then you can raise my pay to their level instead. Kami knows I do more than they do, lecturing about history and practical lessons when I do literally everything else so that they can take it easy on the technical aspects of combat and teamwork. I make their lessons become reality in the training room. Ozpin took another sip from his cup. You make it sound like you can do their job equally well. I'm saying that if we swapped places, they wouldn't be able to fulfill my job nearly as well, while I can do their job better than they can, depending on the subject. Silence ruled once more in the room, taking over the space as the only truth. Ozpin's face displayed rumination and deep thought. He genuinely seemed to contemplate Naruto's words. Perhaps you'd like you teach a class for Professor Port. He'd take your place in combat training for a day with your being present, and you'd teach for his Grim Studies course for the day with him present as well. Simply to test a theory, of course. As long as I get my raise, that's fair game to me, old man. Naruto turned to leave. One more question. Naruto paused. Why do you keep calling me an old man when I am hardly a few years older than you are? You don't address any of the elder staff in the manner you address me. Really? Naruto almost laughed. I figure out that the Grim aren't natural. Are connected to something that creates it, which would already revolutionize history as we know it. Figure out that you are related in somehow, and you're asking me why I call you an old man. He looked over his shoulder to Ozpin's passive stare. If I can sense a person's semblance and origins, what makes you think you're so special I can't see yours, Oz? Naruto FA. CED forward. When Ozpin had nothing to say, he left through the elevator, the same way he came in, and smiled. He pulled out his scroll and immediately sent a message to Glinda. How does a raise sound? Ozpin was still for a long while. His lips hardly twitched when he breathed. He was dead silent and immobile even when his coffee cooled, the steam no longer wading into the air in steamy cloudy lines. He never questioned me on my age or relation to Salem, he said in a whisper, more for himself. Nobody else was in the room. Even when Naruto had actually gotten an answer, the only question young professor had was why hadn't more people known. Ozpin's pupils dilated immensely. He looked up to the ceiling and leaned back against his chair, reclining as he breathed out in disappointment. Then, he laughed. It was bitter. But there was a weight that lifted from his shoulders. He played me. I revealed that I affected history to him. Naruto knew he was old. Old to the point that age was simply a number to him at this point. If what the blonde had said before leaving was true, then he knew that this wasn't the first Ozpin, nor would it likely be the last. He was one of many, but all were he. Ozma. Ozpin wearily rubbed his temple with his fingers, massaging the headache that was soon to come. He would spend the rest of the night in his thoughts again. Since when had the child begun to suspect? He had hardly given any tells to his knowing, or any kind of hint that he was on the trail for his connection to the Grimm, and, thus, Salem. The old soul brought the coffee to his lips. It was cold, but still delicious. Strong, powerful, enough roast and grounded beans to last a man an entire week in a single cup. Taste hardly was a factor to him once the years blended together. He asked why nobody else knew. And I foolishly told him that there were only a few others. He wasn't asking for clarification, he was asking to ascertain whether or not I was the one that informed others. And I handed it to him on a silver platter. But now what? Naruto had figured out that Ozpin was the centerpiece in the long battle against Salem. But the blonde had said nothing. He pondered, would Naruto be the key to beating Salem? The child certainly was strong enough to make a difference. Lives would be saved, and he could train the children to the point that they would be a mighty force. By whatever god the child praised and cursed, Naruto was the closest thing they had to the old magic without a connection to the fairy tales. He was a walking contradiction, and yet he towed the line with ease. All of his abilities were based on his aura, but he always said that it was thanks to his semblance that he was able to perform these abilities. But it was not his semblance to create swords out of aura. Nor floating chairs from nothing, nor thin lines of sharp needles that could puncture through a weak, unsuspecting aura barrier. He had thought on this for months already. How much could Naruto do in the war against Salem? Could he end it all? Would he be the one to turn the tides? Summer had silver eyes. Raven was a growing prodigy, as was her brother. Glinda was the best of the best in her year. And possibly out of the entire kingdoms. Atlas was said to be promising a young general straight out of the academy as well. Would this time be the chance he would get to end it all? Ozpin closed his eyes. No. Comparing any of the children to the true monstrosity that Naruto was right now was too much of a disservice, the gap was simply too large, to the blonde. Naruto would wipe all of them out on his own. And he would make it seem simple. He had already proven his might when he could take down an elite Grimm on his own. That was how Ozpin had first gotten wind of the young boy. No trained hunter could accomplish that on their own. At least, hardly any. It would not do to think any longer on the subject at hand. Naruto had shown his hand, and Ozpin his. They had shared what they knew. More he than Naruto, and now all that was left was to wait. To see what Naruto would do with the information he now had. And yet, it was entirely unlike him to think. He had done it for centuries. So Ozpin said in his chair, reclined. Thinking. Even when the night fell and the blanket, punctured with stars, caped itself over the sky, Ozpin was thinking. Because he was truly lonely in this world and nobody truly understood him, he was left alone to his thoughts. I need to ask you something, Raven, Taiyang said. The brash student was chewing through a juicy chicken thigh. Munching with the juice dripping carelessly through his lips. Raven had gotten used to it. She had found it wholly appalling at first, but she couldn't blame him. Not when her brother was the reason why Taiyang had begun to eat like that. She eyed her brother to her side, who had loaded his tray with a pile of food, enough to feed a family that was well off. At first, Kiro hadn't eaten much more than usual. But ever since Naruto had made Taiyang work extra, Kiro had decided to be a bro and join in. Kiro already had poor eating habits, and he was practically rabid once the increased RK load had been pushed into his schedule. She was proud of her little brother for working so hard. Any improvement was breaking new ground, and he was certainly pushing past his mental barrier. It had been an issue that had been on his mind for quite some time, so to see him take on action for his own sake, and Taiyang, she supposed, was great. But it would be even better if he fixed his eating habits. What? She said finally, turning her attention to the one that had called her. The cafeteria, which had been busy as usual, had slowly died down as many students finished their dinner and went off to do whatever it is they wanted in the evening. What normally would have been a difficult conversation to have due to the noise in the room, was now an easy task that required hardly more than a normal speaking volume. Did you really have to challenge those two by yourself? Taiyang asked between bites. Raven shrugged her shoulders. I won, didn't I? Today was meant for team exercise, though. I mean, yeah, it was cool. But still, I didn't want to bring it up at the time since you looked ticked off. He put down his utensils and looked at her. Really looked at her. But you seem all right now, so I needed to ask. I'm more surprised that the professor even let it happen, Kiro said from beside Raven. Usually, the boss is such a stickler for his rules and stipulations that the fact he let this one slide is more impressive to me. Taiyang nodded. It's odd. But Raven, that's not the issue, really. What my issue is that you beat them with your fists, when it was also weapons day. He seemed aggravated, nervous. Fists aren't your weapon. Are you trying to piss your peers off? She had been frustrated after the morning. On any other day, she would have been far more willing to keep up with the expected protocol and actually converse with others. But Naruto had made an absolute fool of her and also had called her a queen. When she was on her back, damp and sweaty, her hair sticking to her face. He had said of all the pieces, she'd probably be the queen due to how aggressive and mobile she was. Capable of performing almost any function in a team, but most likely go forward first to create an advantage. But expendable nonetheless. She had no words that day to spare for any of her classmates, and only a terse, good morning, for her teammates. They had taken the hint and left her be. But it was far worse than the usual Naruto lesson. They had assumed she was tired, or irked that he had beaten her yet again. It happened occasionally. But the degree to which her frustration reached was a new height. Humiliation did not go well with Naruto preaching about her expendability. She refused to be expendable. Raven was so deep in her misery that when she was called up for a spar, she didn't call for her weapon, forgetting that it was weapon training day. She had walked up on her own, her assigned partner for the day watching her with wide eyes. Their NTS waited on the circular stage with confusion, but when Naruto said go, they had no time. The professor gave them the go, so Raven blitzed in and demolished the two with her fists within 2 minutes. It was only after that she realized that she was supposed to call for a sparring sword or her personal weapon. Her team had complimented her, but her disposition showed no signs of improvement. Summer had tried to talk to her. But there was simply no breaking through her shell. Throughout the day, she was cold and silent, worse than the first day of the academy. She sniffed. It's their fault that they were too weak. I knew you'd say that, Taiyang said before she could explain what the opposing pair could have done to prevent her victory. He was sure it would be an educational lecture from her side. But there were more pressing matters. Such as her current mood, and how it affected their team dynamics. The vital festival was coming up soon, and any strange actions or behaviors on he team should be rectified as soon as possible. The issue is that you aren't primarily a hand-to-hand fighter. Raven looked bored. She pressed her knuckles against her right cheek, lips slipping in a fragile slope. Okay. So you're annoyed I hurt their feelings. They should guard that as well. Raven. Summer was beginning to lose her patience as well. Her normally kind and welcoming eyes were now veiled. Can you take us seriously? Not the situation seriously. Them. Her teammates. Out of the 4, Summer was still the leader, and was practically respected by every other first-year student in the campus. Other than the fact she was a bit of a klutz at times, the girl was so genuinely kind and willing to help, passionate to talk, and an open individual that nobody could despise her. Sue Mmer was a one-of-a-kind leader that drew people in for all types of reasons. For Raven, it was because she was strong. Yeah, give me a second. Raven took a moment to prepare her answer as her team left their expectant gazes on her. Well, to answer Taiyang first, it's not as if I'm not trained in hand-to-hand, even before coming to Beacon. If I were unarmed, I'd still be able to take down almost anyone in our class. I can vouch for that, Kiro said, raising his hand barely over his tired eyes. We were both trained to be able to survive, so martial arts were a must. Raven nodded. And besides, we're here to learn combat. Sure, you can say history and grim studies are important. Which they are, Kiro mumbled. But we're really here for combat. To train and hone our ability so that when we go into the field, we won't be taken down. So that we can survive and win against whatever opposition is thrown against us. Raven's blood flared. And if those two kids that I kicked out of the arena can't handle their own ego so that they won't let someone beat them without their primary weapon, then there won't be any rude awakenings out for them left out there. They'll already be dead. There has to be a better way to say it in a nicer manner. And this is the naivete that Raven both loved and hated about Summer. The kind, genuine nature came with a slice of lack of maturity. That could be compared to unrested meat after being cooked. Sure, still great, but could be better. I don't do nice. Practical, yes. And besides, it's not as if I were trying to send them that message anyway. If they don't get it themselves, however, they aren't qualified to be here. Raven, that's going too far. Summer was shaking. Kiro seemed ready to reel in his sister however he could. Taiyang seemed oddly calm, which was the last thing Raven would have expected. They have 4 years to learn here, and even then, we're not expected to go straight into missions outside of the city proper. They'll have a chance in surveillance, border patrol, and more training if they want. And you're saying the cream of the crop that gets accepted into Beacon come into this school with the mines. At that they have 4 more years to eventually reach an acceptable level to become proper huntsmen. Aren't we supposed to be self-sufficient and reliable by the point we graduate? Raven's words came calmly, each word deliberate and pointed. I wasn't aware this academy focused on niceties and proper etiquette before reality. The others had nothing to say in return. Raven huffed and stood up with her tray of food, leaving the rest of her team as they brooded silently. Taiyang sighed. Would it really be too much to ask for your sister to be more accommodating? Seriously, she's chill and keeps to herself. But sometimes she's beyond rough-edged. Reminds me of my dad when he was cooking and I messed up a spice. That was her being accommodating, Kiro said. He shrugged his shoulders and the questioning stares. She has hard opinions, and she's entitled to those. At least she listened to you two before blowing it off. He turned his head to where Raven had gone. Besides, it's not as if I totally disagree with her, you know. Quote, not you, too, Summer said. Kiro returned his attention to the table. It's not like that. If you listened, she said that the worst scenario is that the students NTS will die once they're fully fledged huntsmen, running their own team. She implied that she does care, in her own way. We just don't have time to care about every small step a person takes. And if it's their mental, I don't even know how to approach a person with that subject in mind, especially if we aren't friends. Quote. So she cares. Kiro nodded at Summer. She let her shoulders sag a bit. A small, thankful smile grace her lips. Then it's okay. We didn't figure out what made her upset from this morning, but we can give her some space and try again later. For now, I'm going to go to the lib. Rary to get started on my assignment for Port's class. The other two groaned. Neither of them had started, and it was due on Friday. What a terrible start to the week. It was close to midnight, and Raven was not asleep. There was a deep unease. Her skin tingled with awkward chills that belonged as well as snow during a summer day. Her heavy wool jacket that she had thrown on before going outside hardly did a thing to get rid of the odd goosebumps, but it did supremely well for keeping her warm and turning away the cold. She pocketed her hands inside the jacket, walking aimlessly and letting her body move however she wanted. The hallways she traversed had windows that were evenly spaced and perfectly square, letting in geometrical layers of moonlight that smoothly lit up her path. Someone had left a door open, which was why the inside of the building on the first floor was cold. She cursed whoever it was, deciding it was her business since her dorm was on the first floor. But she didn't know which door. And since every person was already asleep, or should be, unlike a certain black-haired girl with a thick jacket, she felt the best course of action would be to check one exit, and then go back to bed with more sheets. The exit she came across was open. The moonlight pooled in through the canopy of leaves and branches that the trees nearby offered as shade. The broken moon was a beautiful crimson red that had hints of white. She stared at it through the open door, then walked back into the hall where there was a free drink dispenser. Compared to what was offered in the cafeteria, the drinks on display were rather average in quality, but still quite acceptable considering it was free. She picked out 2 hot cocos and walked outside, placing the 2 inside each pocket of her thick jacket and palming them to keep her hands warm. Raven threw the hoodie over her head, the fur outline covering the top of her bangs and resting just above her eyebrows so that she still had a clear view of everything she wanted to see. Right now, she wanted to see the moon at a high vantage point, where no other buildings would obfuscate the scene. Looking around quickly, she closed in on a building nearby that towered above those around it. The library and Ozpin's quarters were far away enough that they wouldn't block the view. Once Raven walked over, she adeptly channeled her aura through her body. Practicing every day had made it significantly easier to control. Before coming to Beacon, she had thought that her control had been quite skilled, especially for her age. However, only a month into the first year, she had come to tame her tumultuous aura a fair margin so that they were no longer waves but rather ripples. She had been satisfied before with her control, but no longer. Not when the goal she reached and yearned for was absolute calm. Raven jumped up, using windowsills and small ledges on the walls to propel herself upwards. She stepped lightly onto the flat roof and turned around, tilting her head up to look at the sky. How dull. It's the same as in the forest. She sat down, pulling out a glass bottled hot cocoa. Raven closed her eyes and took a sip. It was rather good. It warmed her stomach, and she felt the heat travel throughout her body. Someone slurped behind her. Raven reached for her sword, but her hand grabbed air. She looked up from her empty hand, her body already in stance for battle. The moon is beautiful from here, no. Raven looked at the young blonde professor eating ramen from a bowl, a cup of tea steaming by his side. He breathed in while slurping the noodles greedily, eating the one unhealthy food in his diet that he loved. Ramen, he called it. She had tried it once by his pressing and had found it rather displeasing in the amount of salt present in the dish. His response was simply, "That's what makes it so good. Because it's so bad." So he sat there, content and satiated fully when the bowl was finished. Was it coincidence that the two had both ended up on the same rooftop? Was the tingle and discomfort she felt earlier a sense of connection and it was telling her to come here, to this very spot, so that the two would meet? "You could sit down next to me and look at the moon," Naruto suggested amicably. He was relaxed, even around her, as if what he had said in the morning had never happened. Raven half thought about jumping back down to the ground. But she recalled a detail that changed her fluctuating mind. Naruto was sitting on a recess on the top of the roof, perfectly crafted for sitting. It was wide enough for a group of 10 to sit comfortably with some space in between, and deep enough to have the back of the knees flush against the corner while still being able to lean back a few inches for comfortably rest against the back surface. It was comparable to a bench, but made out of the building, or was it into the building? His finished bowl of ramen was to his right. She could smell it from where she stood. Salty. But she had little doubt that he had spruced it with his own ingredients to make it bearable if any unlucky soul dared to ask for a taste. She strode forward, her feet gliding. Then, she sat on the recess. The door to the stairs directly to her right. The two were a couple of feet apart. She was comfortable enough that she would sit with him alone, but not so comfortable as to sit directly beside him. Naruto placed his finished bowl to his left and sighed in content, then looked up at the sky for a minute. A silence brewed. "Didn't take you for a night owl," Raven said. "Didn't take you for a night raven. Either. I don't know how long you waited to use that, but it wasn't as clever as you probably thought it was. On the spot, I swear it. Besides, I'm sure you thought it was slightly humorous, ya know." Naruto grinned and rolled his shoulders. "What's got you up?" Raven crossed her arms and pulled her jacket closer to her body to ward off the cold and the uncomfortable feeling she had been undergoing the whole time. Her ruby eyes softly gazed on the puffs of cloudy air that passed out of her lips. I'm not sure. I just felt like I needed to stay awake for something. You felt uneasy. Raven shook her head. Then was it something in the air that you were able to recognize? She ripped her eyes from the fragmented to the wholly young and confident blonde beside her. No. Something was amiss. She pulled out one of the hot cocos and held it out for Naruto. He stared at the object in her hand quizzically, and Raven realized with slight shame she had never offered him something before. For your birthday. Take it, she said. The explanation seemed to clear any doubts on her professor's side, whose face lit up and snatched the drink quickly. Thank you. And his smile was way too bright for what was supposed to be the deepest time of the night. She turned away so that the moon reflected in her eyes again, taking out her own drink from the other pocket of her wool jacket. The feeling of unease had dissipated, and instead, all was back to normal. She wasn't certain, but perhaps she was correct in her assumptions about what this meant. I think. Cheers. Raven was interrupted by Naruto thrusting his open drink to her. He waited for her as she slowly uncapped her own, and then lightly tapped the bottle with her own. The two sipped on their sugary, sweet drinks in amicable silence. When their drinks were done, Naruto picked them both up with a light channel of aura that tossed them into a trash bin that was near the door. Are there trash bins on every roof? Raven pondered aloud. Naruto easily chuckled. No, I put this one outside. His lips curled and his eyes dimmed marginally. I wanted to apologize for earlier. Well, he awkwardly scratched the back of his head and closed his eyes, letting out a whimper of a laugh. I suppose I should be apologizing for more than just today. Raven said nothing. Naruto didn't seem to mind. His eyes were on the rooftop's tiles. As a professor, my job is to teach you the best I am able. Personally, I think I do well enough on the front of combat. However, as a professor, that is teaching in a prestigious academy known for their graduates in a combat aspect, I believe I hold a consequential amount of sway and influence. This is only heightened by the fact that I hold the title of a combat instructor at a young age. A cloud of cold air rushed out as Naruto sighed. Influence doesn't necessarily mean respect. I know many of the students don't view me in that way, it doesn't change the truth that I live rent-free in many of their minds. Raven agreed mentally. My beliefs and my words, the way I carry myself, and my perspectives are all subjective and so I should be proffering to the students as another point of view, not as truth. What I did earlier this morning was not in line as a professor. He rubbed his bare hands against each other, thumb pressing on the back of the other thumb. If you want to be a king, you can be a king. My personal beliefs and convictions are merely a perspective taken by one that has seen a different life, and each person should take up their own and be inspired by their own inspirations. So, I apologize to you. Naruto fell silent, and Raven wasn't sure how to break the heavy atmosphere that had suddenly taken over. She didn't know how to respond. Sure, she was frustrated, but it was more because she was weak. Not in comparison to her fellow students, but in comparison to her professor. She hardly cared about the education or political aspect. But she had to admit that they were important and that he was superior in those regards. It was why she actually tried in her other classes. No, what really mattered was strength and combat. And in that, he excelled. He excelled to the point that there was still not an article or biography that accurately caught how large of a gap there was between a normal student and Naruto. It was doubtful that one could understand that gaping chasm without sparring against him first, and to do that, one had to be rather acceptably strong already. She had thought her upbringing would give her an advantage, but there was another young than she who came from nothing, apparently, and was far further in combat knowledge. Her thoughts were turning darker, and she palmed her chin harshly. In the end of the day, did it matter if she was king or queen or whatever? If she was weak, then that was it. She was simply too weak. So what would it? By the way, you wanted to say something earlier, right? Raven bolted up. She had almost drowned herself in self-pity. She would not allow that. Raven took a moment to steel herself, and then nodded. She straightened her posture and locked eyes with Naruto. I was upset earlier, perhaps frustrated is the more apt word. I'm constantly reminded that I'm weak when I fight against you, and it stings my pride every time. I've almost come to accept that you are better than I am in almost every way that matters, but I don't want to accept it yet. Even if it has been over a month and I can't get close to making you try, I don't want to admit it." Naruto didn't say anything, but he smiled wistfully. Of course he did. Of course he would somehow understand what her words meant. She gulped. This was it. "I actually wanted to ask something, though." He nodded, so she pressed forward. "My semblance provides me the ability to teleport any distance as long as I have a connection to the person. This connection tends to provide me a sense of a person's feelings and, recently, has been giving me a weird sensation that provides a description of their surroundings." Why do you feel like this on your birthday?" She didn't feel as bad about admitting her semblance as she thought she would. He had it on paper somewhere, and even if he didn't know, from reading it, he probably already knew. He just did. Probably. Raven watched as Naruto's expressions shifted from understanding, to thoughtful, and finally to sadness. "This is hardly birthday talk," he said weakly. Raven knew that, but that could be said or all of the other stuff that he had started. "Well, thank you for trusting me enough to tell me that about yourself. I know that it's sensitive information and that many students won't even write L of her capabilities on the application to the school, so your explanation to me personally is something I'll hold special." "Thank you. You're welcome." Birthdays are celebrated as the day we are born. Special. People from your family come from all over to congregate for you, and you do whatever it is you do to celebrate. Slice cake, dance, sing, party, play games. Spar, open presents, share good stories and intoxicating drinks that loose lips. And you have a grand time. No matter if you don't have direct family, then someone would still throw something for your birthday simply because it's a special day. Raven couldn't deny those words. She and Kiro had feasts. There was a lot of drinking and rowdiness, and a large splash of crudeness involved, but she loved her clan and the parties they were able to put on. Warmth from the memories touched her mind, but a desperate cold strung from her heart. It's difficult to curb the jealousy that comes on this day, because I can't see it that way. Not anymore. The winds of winter were now freely sweeping across Raven's skin and blood. Naruto's thoughts were undoubtedly pressing into hardened territory. At one point, I think I could Avenue pushed past and celebrated with others happily and merrily. Raven wanted so badly to tell him that he still could, but his eyes were dead. Cold. His bright blue eyes were azure and glowing with darkness. "My parents never were able to celebrate with me because they died the day I was born. I had no one close to me to start the celebrations and I lived in an isolated fragment of the world No one would be able to come to me easily. It's a wonder I survived." Naruto turned his head and caught Raven's eyes. He looked back at the ground, back slightly hunched over. "Sorry, I digressed. Point is, I cannot easily celebrate my birthday when it is a reminder for a day of death for me, as both of my parents died the day I was born." What was Raven supposed to say? Sorry. No, she wasn't sorry. She hardly knew her parents either, so she understood him. But even she had some fondness for birthdays. The fact that Naruto's emotions towards the celebratory day was entirely negative didn't match up. "I don't think I get the full picture." Naruto sighed, and then the pure bleak and cynical attitude that had pervaded his person suddenly disappeared. His smile, however, did not return. The moon reflected in his eyes. And he gazed his hand out to it. "We have similar semblances, you and I. You can connect to others through a link, warping from your current spot to another. I can sense others' emotions." There was no way that the small snippet he just said was everything he was capable of with his semblance, but it was a hint, and Raven was actually surprised he even gave a straight description of one of his capabilities. "I appreciate the act of giving and receiving, and I love presents and gifts. However, I despise the date of my birth. It's the day I lost incredibly special people to me. And I can't forget it." Raven never thought of Naruto as someone to not be able to move forward, but there was now something she realized that she was proven wrong. He was the strongest person she knew. And that also included the strongest feeling of resentment towards his birthday. Whether it was because he was born, or his loss of parents, or whatever discernible reason there could be found. He couldn't move on from it. She didn't understand it. She couldn't and, therefore, felt irritated by it. Because this wasn't the Naruto she knew. Naruto must have felt her growing aggravation. Because he stood up quickly, bracing his hands against his knees and pushing off into a straight stance. We should get some sleep. After all, we both have early days tomorrow, right? Without waiting for a response, he walked away. Before he jumped off the edge of the roof, he turned to face her fully and said, "Also, thank you very much for your gift and thoughtfulness. I appreciate it and cherish it fully." Raven sat for a few minutes longer, lost in her mired thoughts. Entangled and thoroughly wired, her introspection turned into a deep rumination that no amount of scrutin could clear out in only a single night. However, she did realize two things. Firstly, she had forgotten to tell Naruto that she was going to take the trip with him to Atlas. And secondly, she wanted to see Naruto move past his hatred towards the 10th of October. She swore this to the fractured moon. Naruto was laying in his bed, wide awake. Despite what he told Raven, he couldn't bring himself to sleep yet. Not when it was his birthday. Perhaps he was wrong to tell her so much, but he trusted her. Trusted her enough that she wouldn't tell anybody, and he knew that she cared enough about him to not pity him. He rolled to his side so that the moon's light illuminated softly against his body and face. One life of parents gone, I could understand. I moved on. And I did. One more, and I did. He gripped the blankets in a full fist. But once aware of a cycle, how could I not want to break out? Realizing there was no escape from this cage, who wouldn't become defeatist and angry? Raven couldn't understand because he was 16, yet not 16. He was, like Ozpin, as a loose comparison. A drifting soul, that key word. Not once was he ever aware of his soul, until Remnant. Because of this world's attunement to one's souls and his specific semblance, he was able to become far more in tune with his soul than any other person. In any lifetime. Naruto Uzumaki of the Hidden Leaf. The Sage. Another Naruto Uzumaki. A hard-working technician. And yet another. Each one, living through their traumatic childhoods to become greater than what they initially thought they were. The shackles that reigned them in his adolescence were released each time. Except this time, this world released the shackles far too early, but it came with the price of knowledge. His soul was the same. Every time. And his life. He would never, ever have parents, no matter how many lifetimes his soul went through. Of all of the triumphs and uphill battles he had tread through and defied to reach the apex of each mountain, this was one hill he could not overcome. Never would Naruto Uzumaki, in any future or past life, receive a mother's love in the physical sense. Nor a father's care. He would only be left with a hollow placeholder where a parent's love should have been in his heart and mind. He cried himself to sleep, still holding the blankets in a vice grip. 3 weeks passed far too quickly for Raven's tastes. She pushed herself beyond what she thought she could, but her body complied with her wishes and never gave out on her. It wouldn't allow failure, and neither would her mind. At the end of the 3rd week, Raven approached Naruto and told him she would join him for his trip to Atlas. He responded with his usual smile and affable nature, but she could never forget what she saw and felt that night on the rooftop. It had haunted her every night, and she would spend hours restlessly staring at the ceiling on those cursed nights when she couldn't sleep immediately. Which was happening less often. But the confusion was beginning to grate her more intensely. She took out her frustration by training and evolving herself. There was no time to be distracted. That's what she told herself. But she was always thinking about it in the back of her mind. Now that she focused on it, however, she could sense that her link to Naruto always held that minuscule sense of hatred and unchecked anger. It was like a rock formation in a beach. Hardly noticeable, but so obviously discolored and mismatched compared to the rest of his feelings that it stood out once it was noticed. Then, it became like a landmark. And she honed on it and became acutely aware of it. His anger never dissipated, but his positive energy tended to overwhelm the negative. Everyone else fluctuated in their emotions. At least, from her small sample size of people she had linked to with her semblance, she could see it. Kiro was having an off day and felt particularly miffed, and he was annoyed that she was spending less and less time with the team. But he left her be. His mood had been dipping, and her link with him showed that. The link she had with the chief was far more stable, but even he had days where it would fluctuate. But Naruto's emotions were almost stagnant. Sure, There were waves, but it was similar to the waves that crashed onto shore. At the end of the day, the changes were hardly noticeable against the whole beach and would only be perceptible over years and years of change, unless something drastic happened. Like on his birthday. She had to stop thinking about it. The vital festival was soon to come. And the trip to Atlas even before that. She had to focus. Another week passed, and the day of the trip to Atlas came sooner than expected. Raven, Glinda, Naruto, and a few other students Raven had never met before were standing at Beacon's Bullhead dock. Each student was fully packed and ready to leave for the trip. I've chosen each of you for this trip for the practical means of learning from Atlas, professors and the getting a first-hand impression of their lifestyle. I want you to enjoy yourselves, and there will be plenty of time for that, but first and foremost, I want each and every one of you to be well aware that you are all students and I am your professor. Naruto's voice was hard and left no way for questions. It was a tone that not a single soul rejected or refused to comply with once they knew who Naruto was. Respect him or not, you didn't deny his strength. If I say that we're leaving immediately, you'll be on the bullhead within minutes. Understood? Yes. The group of 6 students chorused with varying levels of enthusiasm. Naruto grinned. Good, he said with a clap of his hands. All right, let's go. He turned and entered the bullhead, and the other 6 followed behind him. Soon, the traveling group was off in the skies and traveling to the friendly kingdom of Atlas. The end. Thanks for watching. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.